Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of those of you who are following on the web, if you are able to follow on the web, and call this meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council to order. It's a two-day meeting. Today is Thursday, September 29th. The first item will be the roll call.
Johnston here.
Weinberg here.
I'm sorry.
Brown here. Tatayan here.
Fiorini here.
PFO here.
We have a quorum. At this time, we will recess to closed executive session. I expect it is now 9:02. It is likely we will not be returning until about 10:30. That would be a good target, plus or minus 15 minutes to tune back in. So we are now recessed for closed executive session. Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Bob, are we live? Okay, great. Then we will now reconvene in open session. There was no action taken in closed session. That completes file item number 3, file item number 4. We're on to file item number 5, the adoption of the August 25th, 2016 meeting summary.
I'll move the item, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
We have a motion to move and second. Any discussion? Let's vote.
Weinberg, aye.
Brown, aye.
Tatayan, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
PFO, aye.
Motion passes unanimously. File item number 6, the chair's report. Just very briefly on the schedule today, Jessica will discuss in greater detail the items before us today and tomorrow. But in terms of today's schedule, one, we have panelists, 3 panelists that are here to facilitate file item number 9, implementation of Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy. And due to scheduling considerations and the fact that they are here now, we'll move to that item as swiftly as we can, which will likely mean that the lead scientist report will be delayed until after lunch.
We can also move the executive officer's report as well.
Great.
At your discretion.
Great. So I will get through my lengthy report, and so panelists, be prepared to come to the presenters table in a few minutes. Thank you. The other item of importance is that we had scheduled under file item number 11, the single-year water transfers. They're in an effort to provide everybody the maximum opportunity to provide comment. That item won't be taken up until later on this afternoon. And the council will not be taking any action until after 5 o'clock. So there may be a break in the action this afternoon to facilitate that timing of the file item number 11, which means we won't be finished until sometime after 5 today. And then the last item is on file item number 10, discussion of the Delta Plan revisions regarding priorities for state Delta levies investment. We had that teed up to have further conversations. Additionally, earlier on, we had agreed to form a 2-by-2 committee of flood board members and council members. We have been unable to schedule that meeting. It's now scheduled for later in October. So we've decided to delay file item number 10 until we've had a chance to convene with our colleagues from the flood board, and we'll bring it up at the appropriate time at a later council meeting. So being the agency that advocates being nimble, that's what we're being today. Council members, any questions or comments on that? Then that completes file item. Oh, one other thing. I had a delightful day in the field yesterday. It was good to get out of the office and to visit a wetlands project in San Joaquin County. Very, very impressive. A lot of work has gone into that particular project, and it was just wonderful to be out in the field and to see a concerted effort on creating wetlands, and particularly in support of bird habitat. So nice to be out in the field.
And Mary and I joined you in that, and it was impressive, the compatibility with agriculture. So that kind of cooperation, I know the Delta Protection Commission is interested in too, is noteworthy and worth encouraging.
Yeah, and we've, one of the recommendations in the Delta Plan is to promote wildlife-friendly farming. We have been working behind the scenes with others, including the Protection Commission, the Conservancy, private enterprise. So to be able to witness something that is working well, that could potentially serve as a model to be replicated in other places, very, very encouraging. So in addition to all the great work that Resources is doing in the Yolo Bypass and other areas. So. Okay, with that, let's jump forward now to file item number 9. Scott Brandel is going to be our staff lead and call up the panelists. This is the implementation of the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy file item.
I'm just going to turn it over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, Chair Fiorini and members of the council. Red is on. Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, Chairman Fiorini, members of the council. We've come this morning to present the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy. As you know, long-term fish monitoring in the Delta has surveys in the Delta have recorded record low numbers of Delta smelt the previous 2 years. The resiliency strategy is a set of 13 actions intended to improve the status of the Delta smelt. These are near-term and urgent actions that are intended to be taken. They range from outflow augmentation to aquatic weed control and things like improving spawning habitat. Work on the strategy has begun, and the panel will provide information on some of the more high-profile actions. Introducing the resiliency strategy is Chris Turnell, to my right, Special Assistant for Water Policy at the California Natural Resource Agency. Cindy Messer, the Assistant Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Water Resources, will provide an update on one of the actions that occurred this summer, the Delta Smelt Food Web Pulse Flow in the Yolo Bypass. And Carl Wilcox, Policy Advisor to the Director for the Delta, coming from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, will talk about some of the high-profile actions to come, including the possible summer outflow action next year.
Okay.
Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, panelists.
And thanks for the introduction. So again, Chris Turnell, Special Assistant for Water Policy at the California Natural Resources Agency. It's a pleasure to be here today. A couple things that was just mentioned, but I'm going to just briefly go over the origin and really the overarching purpose of the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy. Cindy will talk about a couple of the early successes that we've been able to move forward so far in this very short period of time, followed by Carl, who will talk a little bit about some of the other, like was mentioned, higher profile actions that are being contemplated that we thought would be of particular interest to the council. Obviously, we can talk about whatever you might like afterwards, but we took a gander at what that might be, and we're going to go for it. So, or a guess, rather. So earlier this year, we were faced with a couple really challenging facts. One was we were at the beginning of what was likely going to be a fifth year of extreme and widespread drought, not just affecting the Delta region, but statewide. And the other fact that was already mentioned was we were facing continued declining trawling data and increasingly worse data from Delta Smelt surveys, obviously in the Delta region. And the information that was coming back was so bad that it actually prompted, to a large degree, I would suspect, the Delta Science Program Symposium in late March of this year that was called Delta and Longfin Smelt is Extinction Inevitable? Certainly an ominous title if there ever was one. It became clear that there was an opportunity and a tremendous need for a coordinated effort to do something about the situation. So with the Natural Resources Agency taking the lead, we worked very closely with Department of Water Resources, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, other partners, and began crafting a strategy to do just that, to start addressing these issues. So we looked across the Delta Smelt life cycle using the good work done by the Interagency Ecological Program on life cycle work. We pulled from recommendations coming out of the Delta Science Program Symposium earlier that March. And we identified actions that could be advanced in the next several years. It was also determined that throughout the implementation, CSAMP, or the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, would be used as the forum for determining the research questions and the actions necessary to assess whether or not what we were going to be doing in the implementation of the strategy was working, was successful, and if so, if not, how to adjust going forward, recognizing that that form of adaptive management is certainly critical for this type of work. The timing of all of this realization and invigorated effort worked well with the budget process. So through the May revise process, we were able to insert $4+ million into the governor's 2016-2017 budget to help seed some of the early efforts, one of which Cindy will focus on in a moment here. And in July, the official Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy was released to the public. So bigger question, what is the resiliency strategy? I think in my mind, I'd like to think of it kind of like the California Water Action Plan for Delta Smelt. The value of the California Water Action Plan, as I think everybody in this room by now is probably pretty aware of, was that it cut through the fog of water management overwhelm by articulating in a mere 20 pages a very clear strategy for at least setting up the foundation for long-term improvements to our water management structure. And it set a 5-year path to do that, something that had really never been done before. And that approach essentially created a center of strategic and policy gravity around which budget decisions could be made, around which state agencies, some of which up here, could rally around. And I think that we've seen pretty tremendous success because of that strategy. So similarly, the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy is an attempt to rise above the rhetorical fray, cut through the politics, and articulate a scientifically sound and doable 3-ish year strategy for really trying to flip this particular fish's fortunes and see what we can get done over the short period of time, how can we do it in a concerted, coordinated fashion, and everything going hopefully very well. Really do see a change in the population dynamic out there in the Delta. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cindy Messer to talk about some of those early successes that we've been able to advance so far.
Great. Well, good morning. Feels like old times. So yeah, I have a few slides, just a few, and I think you all got them as handouts as well. But I get the pleasure of talking about the success story this year. So as Chris mentioned, this is a call to action, the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy, and we were actually able to implement one of the actions this last summer. So let me just take a step back and talk a little bit about why this Delta Smelt food web flow action made its way into the resiliency strategy. And starting with kind of just the easiest why, and both Scott and Chris have touched upon this, is that Delta Smelt abundance is at an all-time low. And we continue to see low numbers in our traditional long-term surveys. So with that in mind, we obviously took a look at what are the major causes of the low numbers, the low abundance, and food limitation is one of those. So this particular action is in the strategy because it helps to begin to address not only limitation on food quantity, but also the quality of the food that Delta Smelt and other key species in the Delta require. So this graphic is just, and I shamelessly took these from Dr. Ted Summer, who recently did a presentation on this topic as well. But this just gives you a really clear sense over time, throughout the seasons, throughout different life stages for Delta Smelt, that the numbers remain very low. Oh, okay, great. I was worried I wasn't going to be able to work this. So, okay. There were also a couple of other reasons for this particular action and what made this, just so one of the central pieces of the resiliency strategy, and that is that there were past events that occurred naturally that led us to believe that we could successfully implement this action. So back in 2011 and 2012, there were higher than normal outflow, or ag return flows, I should say, coming out of the Yolo bypass that spurred a plankton bloom in the Delta in the Rio Vista area. So scientists detected that blip in the phytoplankton numbers and kind of retraced it back to water that was coming out of the bypass. So we thought, well, maybe we could recreate this event on an annual basis with very little or no cost to water users. And I will talk a bit more about that as we go through what the action was entailed for this year. So let me maybe just talk a little bit about what we hope to accomplish kind of in the short term. So this year and the next 2 years as we implement this strategy, and then obviously the long-term goal. So in the short run, what we wanted to do was get something implemented, get a pilot effort on the ground, work out the kinks as you will, adopt an adaptive management approach to this action as well as all of the actions in the resiliency strategy, learn what we could learn this year, apply it to the next several years, revise the work plan and the action itself, and continue to make this a very efficient and effective means to help Delta Smelt out. So that was our short-term goal. I think we met those. We got an action on the ground. We're still analyzing all of the sampling that we did, and I'll quickly run through the list of the monitoring that occurred around this action. And we have some lessons learned, and we definitely worked through a lot of kinks that I think in the next several years are going to make this even more successful. And of course, our longer-term goal is helping to address the food limitation issues. So let me talk a little bit and I know many of you have probably read the press release. This was made the news and media and quite a few different venues, so we were very pleased about that. But I'll quickly run through what the action was itself. So this year, what we did was we redirected water out of the Sacramento River through the Colusa Basin Drain, and this map gives you a sense of that route with the red dotted line. We then continued to redirect the water through the Knights Landing Ridge Cut, slough, past the Wallace Weir, and this is key, and I'll talk about that in a minute, through the bypass and into the Delta. And we were able to pick up signals from that pulse flow down around Rio Vista and other stations in the Delta. We redirected about 12,750 acre-feet total of water through the bypass, and we did this over about a 3-week period in July. So one of the things I wanted to mention, just to give you a little context about why we're very excited about this action and the fact that we were able to implement it this year, is that we had some current conditions, if you will, around which we had to work pretty quickly. So There's quite a bit of activity in the Yolo bypass, some other priority efforts, construction of the Wallace Weir being one of those. And so we kind of found ourselves meeting up against a construction schedule for the weir, so we had to quickly adjust our timing for this action. We originally had thought about doing this later in August, maybe the first part of September, but that wasn't going to work for this year. So we kind of rallied around an earlier date, looked at a source of water, and quickly gathered our partners, which are all the boxes that you see, and then some in this map, to figure out how to move that water through the system in the time that we had to do it. So big kudos to Chris and Carl and Ted Summer and others, Jared Franson and others at DWR for pulling this together in a very short amount of time. It was an exciting, 4 weeks, 5 weeks of getting this together. And then in terms of monitoring, so we have the pulse flow that's moved through the system. We also were able to rally around getting extensive monitoring done. And some of the parameters we looked at was very careful tracking of the pulse flow throughout the system out into the delta. We took a look at a whole slew of water quality parameters. I don't have the full list, but some that I have are nitrogen, phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, pH, total dissolved solids, some organic carbon, and I know there are others. So we were able to get some good water quality data collected. Of course, we looked at phytoplankton. We'll be getting some zooplankton samples analyzed so we could take a look at the amount of response that we had in those species and the species themselves. We also did some contaminant monitoring for some pesticides, herbicides, and then some benthic monitoring, mostly around clams and any response that we would see in terms of the phytoplankton bloom. So very quickly, I know I've got the map up here. I wanted to mention and a head nod to the partners that came together to pull this action off. In my mind, this was another successful outcome, which was just an amazing degree of collaboration and coordination, not only with the local entities, but various state agencies, the federal agencies, and some of our academic partners to help with the sampling. So maybe I don't need to run through the whole list just for sake of time, but I did want to give a head nod to the folks that are on this map who helped secure the water, move the water through, the federal agencies who, as well as Department of Fish and Wildlife, who at the same time were wrestling through the temperature management plan with Shasta, and that factored into our ability to bring some water to redirect through the bypass and back out to the delta. There was definitely a lot of coordination to pull that piece together. And I think maybe I'll leave it there. A lot of project coordination and leadership through Chris and Carl and Ted Summer. So, let's see, acknowledgement to the partners. And then I just wanted to maybe wrap up with a couple things. The most exciting being this outcome that we were able to see about a month or so after the pulse flow went through the bypass. This is chlorophyll A measurements at Rio Vista, and you can see the big spike and the big bloom detected out at this location in the delta. The species, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Sam was coaching me, but I'll still butcher it. Thanks, Cliff. Yeah, that one. That would be absolutely. So this is a species, and what we did was we got a little nervous because this was at the point in time when there was a lot of attention around harmful algal blooms going on. So we thought, man, we better get out there and make sure that we're not, creating more bad species, if you will. So we went out and did some additional grab samples and quickly did laboratory work to identify the species. And in fact, we found that this bloom was made up of beneficial or good species of phytoplankton. And then we also did some backtracking with stations up the Sacramento River just to reassure ourselves that the bloom wasn't coming down the river, but in fact was coming through this pathway that we had created in the bypass. And we were able to also detect that with the sampling and the monitoring we had in place. So I'll wrap this up with our thoughts on where we go from here. So we most definitely will repeat this exercise, or at least we are very, very sure we're going to be able to repeat this exercise in 2017 and 2018. We're looking at possibly maybe more than one event in the year, but obviously that requires us to take a look at sources of water. Ideally, what we would do is maybe shoot for the late August, early September timeframe when we would have ag return water. That was our original goal. But having seen such a positive response, even in July, with a different water source, we're going to be looking at what our options might be for the next couple of years to repeat this exercise and enhance it. And as Chris mentioned, we did receive funding through the governor's budget that will carry us through the next several fiscal years. So stay tuned. We definitely will have a fuller story of what happened when we start to get the other samples processed and we pull that together in some sort of a publication, I imagine. So I think with that, unless I've forgotten anything, I will pass it to Carl.
Welcome, Carl.
Thank you for having us. Carl Wilcox, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm just going to run through, there are more actions that are identified in the resiliency strategy. 9 of them are really things that, based on the plight of the species this year as a result really of the last 4 years of drought and the really poor conditions that Delta smelt in particular have experienced within the Delta, and using the conceptual model that's been developed through the Interagency Ecological Program for Delta smelt, we made a strong effort to identify through a brainstorming actions that we could take in an adaptive management way that could potentially provide benefit. So the first 9 actions that are shown within the resiliency strategy are just that. They are things that, and to varying degrees, they're more developed than, some of them are more developed than others. So you start with the aquatic weed and the North Delta food web actions. Those are things that people were already thinking about. The food web enhancement was something that Ted Summer at DWR and his folks had been working on and were looking to implement. The department was able within its this year's budget to get funding to support that. The thing is that, you know, we needed to implement it sooner and on a revised schedule because of other things going on in the bypass. So we actually have spent some of that money in an emergency way in an incredibly quick turnaround to support the diversion of water by RD 108 and RD 2035 to help stimulate and actually make the food web experiment work this year. In the coming years, we'll be relying more, as Cindy indicated, on ag drainage and won't necessarily be having to acquire or work with cooperators to divert flows specifically for that purpose. So, but I think that's something we'll be evaluating since we did see a benefit in July from that action. And that's a kind of a critical time, and that goes to the idea of the summer outflow action. This was a very new thing that is an outgrowth of seeing relatively good conditions this year from a flow perspective and an outflow perspective for Delta smelt, coming out of the last 4 years of really poor outflow conditions, particularly in the spring. And the idea was that if water could be acquired to maintain outflow, which is basically a surrogate for habitat quality within the rearing zone for Delta smelt. So trying to keep rearing habitat as far down the Delta and hopefully into Sassoon Bay, which have been, you know, historically is an important area, we can look at potentially overcoming what appears to be a bottleneck of, even in better years, poor summer conditions that result in basically poor survival, which results in, or poor juvenile survival, which results in lower adult survival in the fall, and then going into the spawning season in the winter. So that was an effort to come up with a way to do it. Unfortunately, given the lateness of the action, issues tied up with particularly Shasta temperature management actions, and just the ability to acquire water on a short time basis, the action wasn't pursued. But we're going to be moving forward this year in developing, we have 6 months to come up with a plan and associated monitoring program to evaluate an action if it can be implemented. So this would lay out when the water would be best applied, have a monitoring program which will be looking to the CSAMP process to help us develop in a collaborative fashion, be ready to implement that, to assess what the benefits coming out of the action would be. Now, all of this plays out in the context of what the water year turns out to be, and whether or not we're going to have a water year that actually generates enough water to be able to buy water for that type of, or acquire water, or have water for that kind of action. So there are a lot of unknowns, so we'll be laying out probably some scenarios about how we would proceed, and that will go into a water plan that would look at not just the summer action, but how that fits together with the temperature management plan for Shasta and the overall operations plans within the requirements of the existing biological opinions and CISA authorizations for the state and federal project, as well as meeting the water quality control standards and those kinds of things. So it's not a simple process to get all those things lined up. And anytime we talk about flow and augmentation of flow as delta outflow, and this is what we've experienced over the last 4 years of the drought, is that it's intimately tied to what you're doing particularly at Shasta, to manage cold water pool. And so that's a very delicate balance to work through. As far as the aquatic weed control program, the department has received funding for that. We're basically going to be working with DWR to implement that. So the funding will primarily go to them and to the Department of not Department of Boating Waterways anymore, but Boating and Waterways, as part of their aquatic weed control and an assessment program to look at that. And that will be a multi-year effort focused, I think, at the first phase primarily on Frank's Tract, but potentially in other places. There are issues to overcome relative to having the appropriate endangered species authorizations. Currently, those are somewhat limited for that program, particularly on the scale we want to pursue it. But the underlying idea there is to improve places like Frank's Tract, potentially Big Break, Sherman Lake, as suitable habitat. They're heavily invaded by particularly Egeria and other aquatic species that serve as great habitat for non-native predatory fish, particularly black bass and other centrarchids. And by reducing the habitat suitability for those species by removing the aquatic weeds, the idea is that we can potentially improve the habitat for Delta smelt, which would use those areas otherwise because it's within their rearing habitat and within the low salinity zone. So that'll be ongoing over the next couple of years, will be implemented starting next year. Other actions of interest and things that aren't so well developed and will require planning over the coming year to get underway are things like how we might reoperate the salinity control gates on Montezuma Slough and Sassoon Marsh to better managed habitat. And there's a tricky interaction that goes on between operation of those gates to keep salinities lower in Sassoon Marsh, as opposed to what the effects of those are on salinity within Sassoon Bay and in the confluence area. So there's a lot of work that's going to have to go on there. The underlying rationale is that if you could keep Montezuma Slough, Nurse Slough, Sassoon Marsh a little fresher, it is potentially better habitat for Delta smelt, and how you might be able to operate that to achieve that benefit. Past studies have shown that this is an important refuge area for that species, and also they tend to be, the food supply is a little better up there potentially, so they're healthier, and they're not as affected by contaminants as fish, let's say in Cache Slough or in Sassoon Bay in general are. So that's kind of the rationale there. Whether or not we can make that work necessarily is going to be something to be determined. There's some additional actions in Sassoon looking at Roaring River and reoperating that to do kind of have the similar effect of the food web augmentation out of the Cache Slough, as like releasing managed wetland water and or water that sits in Roaring River and kind of stews up into a productive soup, and releasing that into Sassoon Bay or into Montezuma Slough to stimulate food web support for Delta smelt in particular, but other species that are within that area. And then also working to coordinate managed wetland drainage in ways that can potentially enhance food web within the tidal channels within Sassoon Marsh and Sassoon Bay. Basically, the managed wetlands bring in water, they hold it. In the matter of holding it, you have a longer residence time. It tends to grow lots of zooplankton, algae that, when released, can provide a stimulatory boost to the receiving waters. So those are things that we'll be working on and hopefully have ready to go next year as we manage into that season. There's some other things that are looking at augmenting turbidity and potentially spawning habitat. Those are things that have to be explored and will probably have regulatory consequences, particularly as it relates to water quality, because it's going to involve putting sediment back into the system to create turbidity and stimulate that. And turbidity is an important factor, particularly for Delta smelt and their success. And then we'll also be working on developing a conceptual plan and potential feasibility study for looking at how we might restore flooded island like Frank's Tract as habitat. Again, this is an issue of, Frank's Tract flooded, lots of aquatic weeds, really dispersed tidal circulation, and very poor habitat, and whether or not we can modify it in a way that it improves the habitat quality for Delta smelt and potentially provides resilience in the future for sea level rise accommodation within that area, as kind of irrespective the low salinity zone moves up into the delta. And by providing improved habitat there that can meet a number of the life history requirements and physical habitat characteristics that can be used by Delta smelt. So we'll be working on that and hope the target is to have that feasibility study and a conceptual plan done by the spring. So then we can move forward with further refinement if it proves to be something that's doable. And that's really basically looking at just placing fill within Frank's Tract to build up the elevations to intertidal and making it a little more like it was historically. And that's something we haven't pursued in the past, and I think is really a potential area for improving conditions. There's certainly going to be issues with probably that we'll need to work with the county and the local communities on, but hopefully balance the benefits for native species as well as the concerns of the local communities as well, because it's going to have navigational issues, probably other kinds of things. It's probably going to have some effect on the booming black bass fishery and tournament fishing that goes on down there. So that's all going to have to be taken into consideration as we go forward. So I think that's it for me. The department did receive $4.2 million this year in kind of reprogrammed drought money. Most of that's going to support the scientific work that's being done relative to the food web augmentation and the invasive weed control program and assessment of that. And then a portion of it's going to go to developing this feasibility study for Frank's Tract. And as we've gotten into it, we've discovered that quite a bit of work's been done on this topic for the Stockton Ship Channel dredging project. So hopefully we can tear off of that stuff. With that,
Good.
we're open to questions.
Good reports all. Let me begin with some observations, and then I think my colleagues may have some questions. It's probably something a conclusion I should have come to a long time ago, but I've recently realized that nothing good happens in the Delta without a champion to move things forward. And evidence of that is EcoRestore, the YOLO partnership that we regularly receive reports on of successes that have been achieved and obstacles that have been overcome through cooperation. So I count the Smelt Resiliency Plan, as another in the efforts of this administration to take some bold action. I know that there's some criticism that not everything that's been proposed has been universally embraced, but I want to tell you, I'm glad that you're taking steps to do something. And this morning I read a report, not very carefully, so I'm not going to comment on it, but Peter Moyle and a colleague issued a report this morning as an outcome of the Smelt symposium that was held at UC Davis many months ago. And I noted one thing about Smelt is that they said something to the effect that if we're lucky and we receive an abundance of cold water, that will have a positive impact on the efforts to try and restore or improve smelt conditions. Luck is not a good strategic plan. We're on the verge, we're on the precipice. There's no question about it. So I just want to begin this conversation by applauding all of you for taking action to try and do something with the limited resources that we have. With that, any comments or questions from Mary?
I had a couple questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm not quite sure of our experts which are best to answer them, but maybe I'll just go through them real quickly and I can come back to them and you can all determine who's the best one. I'm curious if the biological opinions are driving any of these efforts or simply the Endangered Species Act and where the smelt sits in that regard. That's the first question. I'm curious about the 12,750 acre feet.
Maybe just to be fair to them.
Go one at a time?
Yeah, take them one at a time.
I don't confuse them. Thank you.
And then we'll ask for a volunteer from
All right.
the panel to answer each question.
Carl, maybe a thought on that?
Well, I can start with the second one, the 12,000 acre feet.
Just to conclude my question, was that the desired amount of supply or only possibly what was available? I'm trying to get a feel for what the supply means to what your needs are.
The original proposal anticipated something on the order of 24,000 acre feet, and it was really intended to be driven off of ag drainage as the rice fields were drained for harvest. And the water was run down the bypass. So in this case, we were in advance of that since it was July. And the water that was available, it was a shortened time window, and it was also driven to a great degree by the willingness of particularly the Glen-Colusa Irrigation District to actually divert the water at no cost and forego the use of that water, since it was diverted under their rights, and run it through the system. And then that was augmented by RD 108 pumping some additional water, and then the Conaway RD 2035 that provided additional water later in the flow period, because we started to run into issues with actually being able to run water through the Colusa Basin drain because of the Wallace Weir reconstruction. So RD 2038's downstream of that site, so their water came in later in the exercise, but it wasn't as much. But we obviously
You're still seeing
saw
value
a signal.
from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
So and this goes to the issue of taking an adaptive management action, and we took a chance. It seems to have worked. We had monitoring in place. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. On the biological opinions or the ESA criteria for the smelt, about why we're taking it, and I agree with our chair about the bold approach and the aggressive approach and the collaboration being extremely valuable. Is it just strictly a policy decision, or are there environmental responsibilities that we're engaging with at this point?
These are over and above what are required in the biological opinion. Or opinions, or CISA authorizations. So these were actions that were identified as, look, we need to do something more. I think it's in anticipation that, as everybody's aware, the Smelt biological opinion is going to be reconsulted on, and so I think some of this will be actions that we can test while that process is underway. It's not a short process. It will take a couple of years at least. So I think what we're looking at is, at least within the next 2 years, implementing the actions that are within the resiliency plan as ways to assess whether or not what the benefits are, and will those help in addition to what might go into the reconsulted biological opinion.
Okay, and then Cindy, you touched on the blue-green algae, the microcystis issue, and you're not relating that to the smelt. Is that what I understood from your comments?
No, not
Okay.
really. It was just a timing
Okay.
issue and questions it brought up. We wanted to make sure that we
Yeah,
weren't
because that's
adding.
becoming more prevalent throughout the Delta, and I know it's a
Absolutely.
worldwide issue, but it is growing in the Delta, and whether it's drought-related or warm water or flows, we're still unknown and uncertain in those regards. The jury's out, but we're looking at that. I know at the state level, we certainly are at the local level.
Right.
But I'm curious to see if there's any direct connection as that moves forward. Carl, you talked about Frank's Tract possibly being built up or restoration to some degree. I'm going to guess that would be a horribly expensive effort. Do you have any thoughts on the expense to that vision?
No, just a total guess. It could be, very expensive. The question is, are the benefits associated with it worth taking that chance? And, I think given the context of guidance we've gotten from science panels and those kinds of things, we have to do something that's of a scale to be meaningful. And that's, approximately 5,000 acre area that we know is a problem. It could also provide other benefits beyond those to Delta Smelt, particularly as it relates to salinity management and those kinds of things. So that would be what we would be looking at, is, kind of the multiple potential benefits, as well as hopefully reducing the weed problem without having to spray herbicides on it.
And there are a lot of invasive weeds around that Frank's Tract area. Not just hyacinth and agarya,
Right,
but
yeah.
they're layering on top of each other these days. They're building up and not out. And my last question, Mr. Chairman, I'm curious if the rock barrier that was recently installed out in that general area and then removed, and I suppose installed and removed for salinity control, if there's any thought that that could have had an impact on the smelt population, or is that too isolated of a project when we're talking about smelt in general with the delta environment, the size of the delta?
I don't think that we know. It basically restricted habitat, and basically kept Frank's Tract fresher. But the issue, and it potentially could have been beneficial for delta smelt, but it's not particularly suitable habitat. So I don't think was probably a benefit associated with that delta smelt beyond the fact that it allowed for at least some limited water operations in the delta during the summer of 2015, and kept salinity at bay. And I don't think it, and there is was monitoring that was done associated with that, and I don't think the reports have really emerged yet, but there will be information coming out about kind of what the consequences of that were, particularly as it related to what was behind the barrier.
All right, and just a comment, Mr. Chairman, I have determined, made a decision not to run for re-election. I'm not making the statement for that reason. But related to Frank's Tract, I won't be the district supervisor there working with the county and all of the agencies, so whatever I can do in a personal sense to help bridge that leadership and connection with county staff and whoever my replacement is, I'm certainly happy to do that.
Great, thank you.
If you were serving in Congress, you could probably be more help.
Thank you, Chair. Great presentations, and also I'd like to commend you for interagency cooperation and integrated action. Just to echo the chair's comment, it really does seem, we're sort of on the precipice on this, and that time is of the essence. And you've brought up a few areas where there seems to be conflict between some of the strategies and water quality goals. And you mentioned enhanced turbidity and, sort of the nitrogen phosphorus balance and additional organics in the water, organic carbon. And how do you, if time is of the essence and there's clear urgency here, how are you going to deal with those conflicts and then take action? I mean, what's the approach to dealing with that? I mean, you mentioned that you have to deal with it, and we all know from being in this business, nothing happens that fast. But then again, you've got an urgent issue to resolve, and I think for us as with our charge on co-equal goals, you're sort of right in the middle of that. So how do you get timely action on dealing with these conflicts between what you're trying to accomplish and I would think a pretty expedited manner, given the abundance indices and dealing with water quality issues and those kind of conflicts?
Want me to start? Okay.
I know it wasn't an easy question.
No, but it's a good question. Let me just start out with describing our approach to each of these actions. So as Carl mentioned, some are further down the road than others. I think we are fully embracing the adaptive management spirit in this. We're always looking for what are the potential trade-offs or indirect impacts from these actions as we move through. And, I think we have the flexibility to revise and craft these actions in ways that might minimize those other impacts. There may be some actions as we go through and we start to peel away the layers, as that's sort of how I envision as I'm helping out with each of these. Each one's kind of its own project and has many layers and discussions that need to happen, is that we just will have to adjust in some ways to still try to carry out the actions, get the benefits that we're aiming for and meeting the objectives. I haven't quite crossed any bridges yet in terms of when we come across those other impacts, and there isn't maybe a clear way around those. I think we're spending a lot of time this year in this kind of feasibility planning mode to really lay out what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and then kind of where do we go with a work plan from there. But each one definitely has a full suite, ranging from just very minor things to, whether it's regulatory hurdles or just, physical limitations and feasibility. So I don't know if that fully answers your question,
just
but
that, it just seems you've got an urgency here, and if you adjust too much, the efficacy of your strategy can be impacted. And
right.
And if this is really about, how do you deal with the other regulators or the the drinking water people, that kind of stuff, are there things that we could do as an agency that straddles all of those players that maybe could help expedite this process? I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, because I could see, that's why you're being commended for taking action, but then now you've got to work within a complex structure where you may be at odds with others' goals, and how do we get this and how do we get it moving quickly? I'd like to kind of ask Cliff, his perspective on implementation of the strategies, or there are things that we think are more promising out of the whole spectrum of what they're doing than others, or just your opinion on this.
Well, I was going to wait till the council finished asking questions, and I was going to jump in and ask a few of my own, and also provide a little bit additional background. I think there's some additional information that you might be interested in as a council, and then maybe I can get to that, to answering your question.
Oh, that's good. No, that's good. I just wanted to kind of explore this, and if dialogue and discussion, and gee, we all got to find the win-win here. If that's something that you think the council could be helpful with, I think that should be, a role for us, unless, it's not from my other council members.
Chris has a comment, and then I think I want to hear what Cliff has.
Yeah, me too. I'll be fast. Just to get to your question, council member, I think a lot of the strategy is going to just implicitly rely on being at the right place at the right time. And I think that there's a lot of value in having a plan like this articulated in advance so that we can be as ready as humanly possible. And with the understanding that there actually may not be for every one of these actions, a perfect right place at the right time. The example that Cindy went through is a good example. We're constructing Wallace Weir on an extraordinarily fast timeline. They're about to go to 24-hour construction days next week for primarily the benefit of winter run Chinook salmon. Well, that construction schedule was, darn it, right in the way of this action that we had no way of planning that we ever had even an inkling of an idea to do. So what did we have to do? We had to kind of just still go for it and say, okay, we're probably not going to be able to move all 20,000 acre feet of water, but we can move maybe a little bit less. And maybe we can't move it in late August or September like we'd want to, but we can move it in July. Well, should we still do it? Well, heck yes, we should still do it, because we have a little bit of history suggesting that at least in different parts of the year, if we do this, or if it happens accidentally, which is what happened back in 2013, I believe, we actually can see a response. And without having had a little bit of work, at least a little bit of work put into, these are the players that would need to be involved, these are the kinds of things we'd have to consider, what kind of financing would we need, we wouldn't have been able to do it at all. We would have just said, wow, watching that ship go by, so to speak, that would have been a great opportunity. But we actually had this, said, it's not perfect, but let's go ahead and do it. And I think that's where a lot of the value lies.
Planning is good.
Yeah. I suppose I could have just said that.
Cliff, questions?
Yeah, I'll get to questions, but I also wanted to point out a few other points of information, and I also want to teach everybody here a new word.
Thank you, Cliff.
Let me start with one other aspect of this whole story that I think is very well worth bringing to everybody's attention and to the council's attention, and that is that there was a similar event, maybe even stronger in terms of the amount of chlorophyll that was produced, that occurred in the March-April timeframe. So the big March flows that you probably remember spilled into the Yolo bypass. The Yolo bypass then, over a period of time, began to drain back into the delta, into the Sacramento River. And a similar kind of response to the one that was generated by these July flows occurred and I think peaked at something like 30 micrograms of chlorophyll A, and I think the values here are 10 to 15, so even stronger. And that one is, again, a byproduct of what I think you've heard about a lot, and that's the importance of these spring pulse flows in connecting the river and the bypass and the floodplain and getting that water out onto the floodplains, and then as it comes back into the delta, providing the stimulation to the base of the food web. And I think all of us are very interested in the question of whether this is going to cascade upward into an effect on fish, and particularly on an effect on native fishes. And I know that's a lot of what the monitoring program is all about. I found it very, very fascinating that this second induced pulse that was done in July produced a very similar result with the same organism dominating the cause of the increase in chlorophyll. So Alakasira was the big player in this March-April pulse, and again in this July pulse. To me, that wasn't intuitive that was going to occur, and so I've been kind of interested in learning more about this organism. So I've actually spent I have so much quiet time that I can actually do this, but I have spent some of my quieter time actually just digging into the literature on this organism. The organism used to be called Melosira. That was the old name it used to be called. It's been renamed, a little harder to pronounce, Alakasira. And this is an organism that is a form of what is called tychoplankton, T-Y-C-H-O, and then the word plankton. So that's your new word for the day. Tychoplankton are actually organisms that live at the sediment-water interface. They're not planktonic normally, but they get suspended and put up into the water column, and then they can continue to grow and function in the open water. And I want to emphasize that this is a diatom. This is a desirable organism. This is not a cyanobacteria or any of the other harmful algal blooms that, for example, some of which are in the diatom family. This is something that's a good thing to see. Interesting that we saw it 2-3 months apart. I don't know that much, so one of my first questions is, how did the thermal structure of the water compare in the earlier bloom versus the July bloom? Do any of you happen to know by any chance?
I don't myself, but
because I think moving forward, that's a really important thing to assess, because we're talking about doing this, and I certainly think this is a great idea to continue to do this. But if we get into late summer, early fall, are we going to get to temperatures that might not generate a desirable outcome? I don't know. I hope not. But I think that's something that will be worth looking at. The questions I really wanted to have the panel sort of mull over and talk about is that we're talking about doing this action in 2017 with augmentation in the late spring, summer, and in 18. We've heard a lot of discussion about the amount of water that it's going to take. I've seen numbers 85,000 to 200,000 acre feet, or some of the kinds of numbers that have been talked about for future years. This one was, like you say, was 12 or 13,000 acre feet. Could you give me a little bit of update on where we are on the summer augmentation planning for 2017 and 18?
So I think what has been discussed is something in the range of 250,000 acre feet that would be used to augment outflow, depending on the water year type. Either beginning in the spring or later in the summer. And this would primarily be releases into the river system as opposed to into the bypass. So there's a difference. In the bypass, the volumes of water there were basically generated off of what could be run through the system using primarily drain water without adversely affecting ongoing agricultural activities within the bypass. So primarily keeping the flow within the tow drain and the Thule Canal as opposed to getting it outside. So, and really just focused on having a positive outflow from the bypass because under normal conditions without input from upstream, it's basically either a negative system or a just zero, so there's not really any exchange downstream, and it's tidally driven. So they're different in how they would operate, and the larger flow augmentation is basically targeted at affecting outflow, delta outflow, as opposed to what it might be do in relationship to the bypass. You know, one of the things is in doing this action in July, the water that basically was put to it did contribute to outflow in a small way. So there are some synergies depending on how those things can be timed and whether or not they fit with the upstream diverters' ability, particularly in September or in July or earlier in the year, to work with their agricultural operations and their water demand and their water issues. We were fortunate this year, particularly as it related to Glen Calusa, that they were willing to do this and forego the use of that water and putting it through the system.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that? Then I assume that these future year summer low-flow augmentations are more focused on changing the salinity field than stimulating the food web, or are the goals still both?
Well, the flow augmentation would be in affecting the location of the low salinity zone and working to keep it, or intended to keep it farther down the system. So keeping, I think the idea would be to keep X2 at Collinsville or below Collinsville and towards Chips Island for as long as you could with the amount of water you had available. And the idea there is to provide good conditions for rearing delta smelt so that they get to a point where they have the health conditions that they can make it through poorer habitat conditions later in the summer.
Are there constraints on using this summer augmentation flow to occasionally do pulse flows down the Yolo bypass?
I don't think so. I think, as we experienced this year, if we run water down through the system, assuming that we can get the cooperation of the diverters to do that, there's no reason you couldn't do that, because at the end of the day, that water ends up going out through the bypass and contributing to outflow.
Carl, I can't help but weigh in at this point. With the work that's going on at the State Water Resources Control Board and the staff report that's out now on increasing some of the San Joaquin River tributary flows, likely that moving towards phase 2 and outflows, does this thought about targeted pulse flows weigh into your department's thinking and how you will try and influence the water board's decision?
Short answer, yes, in that the way the water board talks about things, it's in the context of unimpaired flow in February, in the February to June period. And the idea that it's unimpaired, that flow needs to be in, particularly in that period, in some relationship to either the natural hydrograph, so you're mimicking it, so it's not that flow all the time. And so the question is that unimpairedness turns into an amount of water, and then the question is, how do you put that amount of water to the best use to meet both the needs in stream within, let's say, the Stanislaus River, and then how does the use of that water for those purposes facilitate improving conditions, let's say at Vernalis and all the way to outflow. And there are interests in other periods of the year, particularly in the San Joaquin system, for having outflow and pulses in the spring or in the winter or late fall to attract adult salmon into the system. So the water board's unimpairedness doesn't account for that. So then you're going to have to look at how you would basically turns into a volume of water and how you would manage that best to meet all of the needs. Certainly one of the issues for the San Joaquin system is that in the summer, there isn't much water that comes out of it. This summer, the outflow at Vernalis was about maybe 300 CFS or something like that.
Okay, Cliff, sorry to interrupt you.
No, please, any of the council, please. Kind of want to follow up with going back to the Delta Smelt resiliency strategy and this idea of augmentation flows. One of the things that I think I and others in the science community keep harping on is this idea that flow is more than just volume. It's also the timing of flow, the frequency of flow, how it ramps up, how it ramps down. These kind of pulses that came through the Loreola bypass certainly seem to have some clear beneficial uses. This discussion of the augmentation, have people begun to delve into these kind of questions of how you're going to actually apply the flow? Are you going to, for example, mostly work on the recession rate as you move from spring to summer? Or are you going to augment fairly constantly throughout the period of time? Or are you going to pulse this through the system in 3 or 4 pulses, for example? Are those kind of discussions and details being worked out as you consider the 2017 and 2018 actions?
Nope, you can start.
I think those are all good questions. I think we're at probably a simpler level at this point in that the target is keeping X2 at a location as opposed to necessarily pulsing and that kind of thing. I think we're at the stage of trying to lay out what would be the pattern of release so that we can then begin to work with the operators on how that might happen and how water may be obtained to be put to that use. So the first step, at least, is, okay, when do we feel it would be most beneficial and what should that look like? And then moving on to how you might do it. The question of pulses, I think, as it relates to outflow, you can have certainly lags if you have a larger pulse and push X2 farther downstream, then it takes quite a while, depending on where you are in the tidal cycle, for it to come back upstream. So you can have that habitat and the pulse would have been bigger to displace it, but then you draw it back down and it's going to come back in. And does having a static, kind of more consistent pattern of habitat work better than one that pulses? And that would be an open, very testable kind of topic. So I think we're just at this point trying to lay out what the rationale would be and what would be based on what we know, the best pattern to try to maintain. And then definitely being elaborating on that as we go forward.
And I assume linking it to water your type.
Yes, definitely.
Cindy, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up a little bit and offer that I agree with Carl. We're kind of at a more simple discussion right now and just laying out some of the foundational scenarios, water year type, X2 location. But part of what the CSAMP is agreed and we've written into the resiliency strategy to do is to help us build a scientific framework around this particular effort and action. So I think that offers us a venue to have a more complicated, if you will, discussion or a more complex discussion and to kind of mull over some of those thoughts and possible options. So I just wanted to offer that up.
And I think, the whole concept of flow augmentation is a very controversial one, particularly coming out of what we have experienced over the last number of years and the very limited allocations, particularly contractors south of the Delta are experiencing. So, the idea that you would be putting this to use and then how does that stack up against other stressors? And so there are a number of issues that I think within the CSAMP process and ultimately within independent review of what we start to come up with, there are going to be a lot of things to discuss about how we move forward and how we assess what the benefits are and what the mechanisms are that are achieving or not achieving what we're anticipating or what we would expect to see.
Ken?
Go ahead. I have a couple other questions, but please.
Just to kind of follow up with Carl, it sounds like although you've got sort of this menu of strategies, is the department focused on managing the location of X2 as the main element?
I think we see that as something that can, it's always the struggle of is it flows or is it something else? That, at least from my simple perspective, when there's water in the system, things tend to do better. So certainly there are other factors, and so I think we're exploring kind of a multiple suite of factors over time. The big one that I think people have honed in on is the flow issue and how you might manage that if you can provide these augmented flows. And from the perspective of Delta Smelt, I don't know that you can emphasize how bad conditions have been for Delta Smelt since 2012, in the summer of 2012. They have been incredibly bad. So, and that badness translates into more invasive aquatic weeds, which translates into more potential predators, which translates into less suitable habitat, which translates into more toxin effects and probably reduced food supply and quality, as well as exacerbating the blue-green algae issues and the toxicity. So, there's lots of things that are going on, but we've seen just miserable conditions. And the idea of having that flow action was to not default back to the minimum outflow requirements that are in D1641, which are very low. Now, they're low, they're not necessarily what actually happens based on the way the projects operate, because they have to operate in a way that keeps salinity away from the pumps, and so that generally requires more than the minimum outflow to achieve. But it was kind of that simple, at least on the first blush.
All right, back to Cliff.
So I want to bring Chris into this conversation because I think there's some aspects of this that I'd love to hear his thoughts on. EcoRestore has about 30,000 acres on its docket of restoration, and about 17,000 acres of that are actually going to be these kind of floodplain connectivity projects. So what do we learn from these pulses that are guiding you or helping you or assisting you in thinking about that part of EcoRestore?
I think it's a great question, and the timing for learning from these experiments and actions is perfect, because we are planning on having ready for the larger YOLO bypass, submonted restoration, floodplain habitat project, EIR, EIS, public draft, late summer of next year. And so to the extent that we can learn from the example that Cindy went through in detail and others that could ostensibly affect how we craft the specifics of the operation of essentially the notch in the Fremont Weir that's going to be facilitating the increased frequency and duration of floodplain inundation. We're certainly going to be looking at that, absolutely. Clearly the focus of that project right now is on sturgeon, salmon, steelhead, but to continue down a path that is exclusively focused on the species that the biological opinion requires us to focus on, at the expense of taking advantage of opportunities that might otherwise be there would certainly be a bad idea. And so we're going to certainly be drawing in this type of data as it's available and trying to adjust as possible. One of the things that the reconstruction of the Wallace Weir allows us to do is it allows us to have significantly more flexibility when it comes to regulating flows from the Colusa Basin drain down through the Knights Landing Ridge Cut into the YOLO bypass. So just that construction project alone, which I mentioned is really focused on keeping winter run Chinook out of the places where they shouldn't be, itself will have, with an adaptive management program associated with it, has the potential to be extraordinarily beneficial for these smelt-focused projects as well.
What's the timeline on the construction?
We started about a month ago, and we plan to end by December 1st. Completed by December 1st.
Good.
Yeah. La Nina willing.
We don't have a La Nina, it's neutral.
All right.
It's a flip of the coin right now.
All right.
There's no strong indication that either of the two streams is going to establish this winter. So just
okay.
The other thing I'd like to just chat a little bit about with the three of you is one of the things, at least in my mind, and this may be because of my training and background, that knits a lot of these things together is what's going on with the nutrients in the system. And I've spent a lot of time working on intermittent systems. That's part of the landscape in the western United States. Most of our streams and rivers are intermittent. And the same kind of process happens in these intermittent systems where you reconnect during the wet season or during a storm or during certain times of the year or during snowmelt in some of your high elevation systems. And you get these same kinds of pulses of materials that kick off, jumpstart basically the food webs in multiple types of ecosystems. And I've always looked at the YOLO bypass and the phenomenal productivity that is produced when you do connect the river to the floodplain as being very analogous to some of the things you also see when some of these intermittent streams and rivers also go through these kind of changes. Nutrients in many cases are the key, and to some extent the form of the nutrient seems to play a role. So I have not seen the data, but I'd be very interested in seeing the data as it comes available, and I suspect our colleagues at the USGS probably have quite a bit of this data, but do any of you know anything about what's been learned so far about the chemistry of the water coming off the YOLO bypass that is involved in these big changes in primary production in chlorophyll A?
No, I don't, specifically. And one thing just to add into the conversation, whether it's for follow-up discussion or for now, the window of time, just so we're all on the same page, that we're looking to affect seasonal inundation of the YOLO bypass is generally between November and middle of March. So just factor that in when you're thinking about potential benefits, impacts, et cetera. That's really the window that we're looking at, increasing frequency and duration of inundation.
And this year we had that natural event that occurred in March, which then really stimulated as we got later in the year as the recession flow began to really kick in. That's when the big first of these blooms came, and then I thought, very well designed, very well thought out experiment. Ted Summers and his group needs to get major kudos for what they did.
Indeed.
Really produced that, and then getting all the water contractors to assist with this. I mean, I think there's just a lot of wins that happened in this whole process, and I hope we continue to understand this a little bit more, because one concern I do have is that this kind of pulsed intermittency does produce these tremendous stimulations to food web and affects positively a lot of the food web. But we still have some fundamental questions about how often can you do this and still get this response, and what's the best timing to do this? What time of year is the best? How long do you leave the water on some of these systems before it drains out? There's still, I think, some fundamental questions that adaptive management experiments could address that I think would be very exciting to develop and implement over the period of the 2017-2018 actions that are being planned. So I'll continue to advocate for that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, what I would say to that is I think we have the infrastructure in the form of relationships set up after this effort this year to allow for that. And I think what really we came up against this year was interesting, which was local agencies on the ground, whether it was GCID, RD 108, RD 2035, working with them wasn't the issue, right? It was getting out of our own way to allow this kind of an effort to go forward. And I think we learned a lot about what it means to get out of our own way and to facilitate this kind of a process, because they're ready and willing. They want to help. And that's fantastic. So, a lot of the work was on our end to figure out contracting, how to do the organization, things along those lines. So I think that infrastructure in the form of relationships is set up and ready to rock and roll for that kind of adaptive management approach to subsequent year experiments.
Yeah, I think particularly the manipulation of flow within the bypass in the summer or fall, we have lots of flexibility, particularly once the Wallace-Weir reconstruction is done. So it can be managed in many ways within the bounds of the agricultural operations and the willingness of folks in the bypass as well as upstream to work with this. And, as Chris pointed out, there was a lot of cooperation and I think a lot of interest on the upstream water users to help. And we've seen that with their efforts on salmon as well. So I think with a permanent alteration of the Wallace-Weir, but the Fremont-Weir ultimately, you would provide the ability to have additional flexibility in when you could bring water off of the Sacramento system in the summer. As Chris said, the focus is on the late fall through early spring because you have the issues particularly with ongoing activities within the bypass. But you can do things that are compatible with those agricultural activities, particularly in the spring, as it may relate to providing adult fish passage for spring run and winter run that are coming up the system and would get into the bypass, and we'll be providing passage ultimately for them, and that means that there's going to be some amount of flow that would be coming through the bypass from the Sacramento River. So I think that it only adds the ability to do more of these kinds of actions in the future if that capacity was there.
Yeah. Other questions of the council? Otherwise, I have one other theme I thought I'd develop briefly with you.
Go for it.
Go for it. Okay. The other one is the issue of evaluating the effectiveness of these 13 actions, and the difficulty of doing that when you have such limited take on Delta Smelt, your target organism. So how are you going to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions with some of the very serious constraints that exist now in the system?
Well, I think the focus is not going to be so much on the fish. It's going to be on let's say, as it relates to the food web augmentation, it's going to be on, did we generate food? and we'll find out what the fish benefit was potentially through the ongoing monitoring for fish, either through the fall midwater trawl or the summer tow net, but not adding more of that kind of sampling. One of the issues that we're confronting right now with the veg management stuff is being able to have any take at all. So how are you going to assess that? And it's probably going to be, are we seeing a decrease in the footprint of vegetation? And then can we sample for non-target fish that we're concerned about, as it relates to reducing habitat quality without getting into a situation where we might incur take? And what's that going to look like? And, this is a real struggle right now with particularly Delta smelt being at such low population levels. How do you authorize the ability to do that without jeopardizing its continued existence? And how do you assess whether or not the benefits of your management actions are doing good things for them? But I think you have to do that by looking at surrogates that would be indicators of improved environmental quality that we know they would benefit from.
And couple it to the long-term ongoing measurements. Yeah. No, I admit that makes good sense to me also. Any other thoughts from the other two of you, or is it pretty much Carl covered? I mean, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult when what you most want to know about how those fish are responding, you can't really go out and directly do any kind of measurement. So there has been, I believe, Peter Moyle in one of his recent papers did suggest the possibility of using captive bred fish in a controlled or contained way to look at some of these things, and I know that's controversial, but I know that has been at least suggested as one way of being able to do some experimental assessment of how the fish are responded. Like, for example, you've done such very nice work on how much the growth rates of the salmon that have been stimulated by the YOLO bypass, and again in some contained systems where you were able to actually measure growth rates and some of the vital rates, which the Independent Science Board, I know, is very eager for vital rates to be more of the measurements of the fish than just the number of fish, for example. So, something to think about anyway. And I know that the bringing up captive bred experimentation has many, many facets that are controversial.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that we'll be confronted with here in the coming year is, is there a way to use the fish that are produced at the fish facility, which are produced for research purposes primarily, to use them back in the wild in a way to help assess or as part of the monitoring or assessment. So I think that's just kind of emerged and will definitely be something that we'll be wrestling with.
I have a question, and then Mary. Cindy, how do you anticipate engaging in the Delta Science program moving forward?
Let's see. Well, I was thinking about that over the last week or so, and I think there's definitely a couple different ways we would like to engage the science program. The first two that come to mind are as we work through developing work plans or whatever form they take for the various actions. Of course, we want to have some independent review of those, and so I think we would want to work through the science program to set those up. I also would welcome the science program's advice on the adaptive management elements of these actions and as we move forward with them. Also, the expertise that program has with the lead scientist, with the staff, and also, keeping a mind to not only generating information but utilizing best available science in these actions. I know the science program is always very much current with the information that's out there that maybe we should be looking at or incorporating or in our actions. So that's just some of the thoughts that came to mind for me.
Mary?
Mr. Chairman, I would just hope that the council would seek further updates on this issue into next year. I think it's an important one to track and watch, and obviously there remain a lot of questions and concerns. I think everybody's headed in a positive direction. Hopefully we'll see some beneficial outcome from it, but reports back to here if the council agrees, I certainly would see as a value.
Okay. Susan?
This is a non-scientist question on parameters, but I'm curious, will you be monitoring the effects of removal of all the invasive vegetation on the unimpairedness of flows and on the food web augmentation?
I think there will probably be some, I don't know about the unimpairedness, I don't think that's going to be a focus of the aquatic weed work that would be proposed as part of the resiliency strategy, because it's primarily focused on modifying habitat in places that are potentially suitable but impacted by just the presence of that, and whether or not by removing it or reducing the amount of it we can generate some benefit, which would be in the form of food production that's more usable by the fish we're concerned with, and whether or not they can use it in that location. One of the things about food webs in Egeria beds or invasive plant beds is that they're really productive, but it's pretty much a closed system. So everybody that's in there is eating each other. So it's not getting exported to other places. I think that's one of the rationales or one of the focuses, and not so much as it relates to how it might affect how flow moves through a channel or a particular area. Certainly, if you look at Frank's tract, the amount of vegetation does have an effect on how water moves through the system.
I think we have provided you all the comments and questions that we have available right now. Jessica, any final thoughts? Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and again commend you for the leadership and the boldness with which you are advancing. The Delta Science Program is obviously interested, as is the council, so we hope to stay in touch and get some regular updates. Thank you all for coming.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any public comment related to file item number 9? None. All right. So we have reached a point where we can break for lunch. It is 12:26. Let me recommend that I be very generous and that we will reconvene at 2 o'clock. And a reminder for anybody that wasn't here earlier that file item number, number 10? File item number 10, dealing with levy investment strategy work, has been pulled from the agenda and will not be taken up today. So I just want to alert those of you who may be here for that matter. It won't happen. So we're in recess until 2 o'clock. Thank you very much, guys. We want to reconvene our meeting. It occurred to me during lunch that as we were developing the Delta plan the first 3 years, Chairman Eisenberg was often criticized for delaying lunch and sometimes eliminating lunch breaks. So I felt pretty good that we had an hour and 25 minutes today for lunch. I don't think we should get used to that, but in contrast to what it could have been, I felt really pretty good. So we're going to pick it up at file item number 7, the Executive Officer's Report, and I'll call on Jessica Pearson.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'll start by noting that we had set 2 public hearings in the Delta on the levy investment strategy discussion draft for October 3rd, and I believe it was October 26th. We sent out a notice this morning on our listserv that those will be postponed and rescheduled. So I wanted to just make sure you're aware that the State Water Resources Control Board has released its draft flow objectives for the San Joaquin River and salinity objectives for the Southern Delta in what's called their SED, or Substitute Environmental Document. There's a lot of acronyms involved in their processes as there are in ours. So SED, this is for phase 1 of their Bay Delta water quality update. The Water Board's proposal updates objectives that were established back in 1995. You may recall that there was a preliminary flow criteria report in 2010. I think that was required by the Reform Act, which concluded that there wasn't enough water being left in the river for fish survival. Since 1995, the state's population and the San Joaquin Valley's agricultural output have grown, fueled in no small part by water exported from the Delta. At the same time, as we heard earlier this morning, and as you're well aware, salmon and steelhead, including those that spawn and rear in the San Joaquin tributaries and migrate through the Delta, have declined sharply, as have smelt. Also, over the past 2 decades, science has shown that stream flows are a major factor in fish survival, albeit not the only one. And at the Water Board's request, we, through the Delta Science Program, have previously facilitated several reviews that were intended to inform the Water Quality Control Plan update, including expert panel reports in 2013 and 2014 on Delta interior flows and Delta outflows and related stressors. And also the board's work is being informed by the Independent Science Board's recent review of Delta flows and fishes, which was 2015, if I'm correct, or late 2014. So the Water Board's proposal recommends a range of between 30% and 60% of the San Joaquin's flow to be left in the river for the benefit of fish species, with a starting point of 40%, and that's during a time certain. As you might imagine, since being released 2 weeks ago, that proposal has drawn a lot of interest from all sides, and there's been a raft of editorials and op-eds which bookend kind of the range of perspectives. The Water Board is now taking public comment on the proposal, with comments due November 15th. Our staff are performing a review, and we also sent a comment letter on an earlier draft that had been developed by the board, I think back in 2012. So we're also going to re-review those comments to see what's still relevant. This is phase 1 of a 4-phase process to update the Water Board's Bay Delta plan and flow objectives. Just as a reminder, phase 2 will include a review of Sacramento and tributary inflows, Delta outflows, Sassoon Marsh salinity, export limits, and the effects of reverse flows in certain Delta waterways, such as Old and Middle rivers. And the phase 2 scientific basis report, as they call it, is expected this fall. And in fact, State Board staff have preliminarily reached out to our staff to notify the Independent Science Board of an interest in having the Independent Science Board review that document. Phase 3 will see the Water Board implement their objectives through water rights actions, and phase 4 will involve implementation of flow objectives in the Sacramento River watershed upstream to address public trust issues. Cliff, I think, is going to also mention some work we've been involved in facilitating a review of net Delta outflow calculations, which is also related to these efforts. Governor Brown sent a letter to Water Board Chair Felicia Marcus urging the board to move quickly to complete the remainder of its analysis. I've included that letter in your packet of handouts. In the letter, the governor says he's directed departments within the Natural Resources Agency to explore potential for a comprehensive agreement through voluntary settlements on environmental flows both in the San Joaquin and Sacramento River basins as a way to speed the process. This was also called for in the governor's water action plan. The departments are to report back to Governor Brown by the end of October with their assessment and a schedule that would enable California to start improving water quality in the Delta and its tributaries in 2017. And just to remind you, our Delta plan originally called for timely completion of the board's work. I think it was June 2014 for flow objectives and 2018 for implementation. The drought somewhat sidelined that work in progress, but we're still following everything they're doing very closely, and I just wanted to give you an idea of how we're involved, particularly through the science program. There was a groundbreaking earlier this month, September 19th, for the largest yet tidal wetland restoration project in the Delta, which I've been keeping you informed of. Local, state, and federal and private industry leaders broke ground on the Tule Red project, which will return salty tides to several hundred acres in the Sassoon Marsh to benefit native fish. The project will open more than 400 acres of wetlands to daily tides with reworked berms and new channels and basins, and the project will create habitat to harbor and boost food production for several threatened or endangered species, including smelt, longfin smelt, delta smelt, and Chinook salmon. You'll recall we've talked about this previously. Staff has worked with the proponents on their adaptive management plan, and the certification of the project with the Delta plan was filed last spring without an appeal. We have nixed our quarterly email newsletter for a few months ago in favor of a series of what we hope to be short, engaging monthly video blogs highlighting the Delta Stewardship Council's projects and programs. So far we've recorded blogs on the levee habitat paper we produced, and also regarding our Delta Science Fellows program, starring Cliff, which we highlighted in advance of the Fellows program application deadline. Forthcoming, we'll have blogs on the Delta Plan Interagency Committee and our levee investment strategy. The best way to view these is by following us on social media, especially Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or you can go to our website at deltacouncil.ca.gov/blogs. As usual, I've included comment letters that we've sent out in your board packet, and there are copies of those out on the table. Just as a quick summary, we've sent letters this month on the Three Creeks Parkway Restoration Project, which is a project approved for funding under the Delta Conservancy's Prop 1 grant program. It's a riparian and floodplain habitat project along Marsh Creek. We also sent comment letters on DWR's Decker Island Restoration Project, which is an eco-restore priority project that will restore 115 acres of tidal wetlands within one of the Delta Plan's priority habitat restoration areas. And council staff commented on the draft San Joaquin County 2035 general plan, which we've been working closely with SJCOG and county staff on in order to ensure its consistency with the Delta plan. We also commented on the City of West Sacramento's proposed general plan update and made some recommendations there to ensure consistency with Delta plan as well. So with that, I think I will turn it over to our legal counsel, Bethany, for a legal update.
Thank you, Jessica. Chair Fiorini and members, I have two updates for you this month. The first is a water quality case in disguise. The case name is State Department of Finance versus Commission on State Mandates. So this may have slipped under the radar for some folks, but it has the potential to have significant effects on Clean Water Act regulation in the state. So I wanted to bring it to your attention. A little bit of history. In 1972, shortly after the enactment of the Clean Water Act, California became the first state to issue what are referred to as national pollutant discharge elimination permits that are certified by US EPA. So California has a history of over 40 years of issuing these permits that regulate, among other things, local government storm drain systems. This particular case reached the state Supreme Court through the Commission on State Mandates adjudication of a reimbursement claim that was made by Los Angeles County and other LA area cities, seeking reimbursement for costs associated with a 2001 NPDES permit issued by the Los Angeles Regional Board. The Regional Board argued to the Commission on State Mandates and then up through the trial court and appellate court that its permit terms were included to implement the Clean Water Act, and because those are federal requirements, they were exempt from state mandate requirements, state reimbursement requirements in the state constitution. The trial court and appellate court agreed, but the Supreme Court did not. The Supreme Court held that specific permit terms requiring trash receptacles and certain site inspections by the local governments that operate the storm drain systems exceeded Clean Water Act requirements. They were therefore state requirements and therefore reimbursable. 3 members of the court dissented, so this was a 4-3 decision, a close decision. The dissenting justices argued that the case should be remanded for the Commission to apply a more deferential standard of review to the water boards and US EPA's experience with issuing these permits, and argued for the burden of proof to switch to the parties seeking reimbursement to prove that these were not federal standards. But that was the dissenting view. One other intriguing point that the dissenters made is that as a result of this decision, the state may be put into a position where it needs to reevaluate its participation ultimately in the NPDES program. This decision itself was limited to these storm drain permits, but there's larger NPDES permits as well that the state implements through the Clean Water Act. And if the state is needing to reimburse for those permit requirements as well, the state may be in a position where it hands the program back ultimately to US EPA to implement. So we'll be tracking any developments on that front. In the meantime, the State Water Board has petitioned the Supreme Court for rehearing. They filed that petition on September 9th, and the court has set November 27th as the date by which they will grant or deny that petition for rehearing. So we'll definitely keep you updated on that. A second case update is one that we've been tracking for you all summer. It's Central Delta Water versus Delta Wetlands Properties, and that is in Contra Costa County Superior Court. You may recall that Central Delta Water alleged that the sale of 5 Delta Islands by Delta Wetlands Property to Metropolitan Water District put the seller, Delta Water Properties, say that 5 times fast, in breach of contract for a settlement agreement they had reached years before. In that settlement agreement, Delta Wetlands had agreed to bind itself and successive owners to land use restrictions that would prevent the islands from being used as a reservoir. But when Met came in to purchase the islands, it stated it had no intention to use the islands for storage purposes. And so Delta Wetlands did not bind Met as its successor to those settlement agreement terms. Petitioners sued and requested a temporary restraining order, which was denied on June 9th. That would have enjoined the sale of the islands. Just a tiny update on the development of this case then. So there was an initial case management conference on August 3rd. Central Delta has submitted an amended complaint, and there is a new case management conference set for November 29th. And we'll continue to keep you updated on this and the other Delta Islands cases as developments warrant. Are there any questions?
Any questions, Bethany? No?
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I'll call up Ryan Stambra. New father, Ryan Stambra.
Yeah, congratulations, Dad.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I wanted to say good morning, but then I realized we're actually in the afternoon. I'll blame a little bit of that on my sleep deprivation. The legislature adjourned for the year on August 31st, officially marking the conclusion of the 2015-2016 legislative session. As a result, September has largely been focused on bills that have advanced to the governor. And as of yesterday, the governor had approximately 150 bills to sign or veto by this Friday. Any bills that are not acted on by the end of the work week would become law by default. As it relates to the council, there are a handful of bills that I'll highlight this afternoon that the governor signed into law earlier this week, and one that is still awaiting action. Starting with the enacted bills. As the council may recall, data management has been the focus of a number of bills this session, including the Delta-focused AB 501 by Assemblymember Levine. However, most of these measures ultimately failed to advance in the legislative process at different points along the way. That said, last Friday, Governor Brown did sign AB 1755 by Assemblymember Bill Dodd, a Democrat from Napa. This is a bill that I've presented to the council over the year, and in its final form, AB 1755 requires the development of data sharing protocols by a consortium of state agencies led by DWR, which will ultimately guide the development of a single data platform to house much of the state's water and ecosystem data. In addition to being consistent with the recommendations in the Delta Plan that recognize the importance of improved data management and the Delta Science Plan, the measure and its approach is consistent with recommendations of the Data Summit White Paper, a collaborative effort led by the Council's Delta Science Program, which emphasizes the importance of developing data standards to serve as the foundation for the establishment and operation of an integrated data system. In fact, with the science program beginning implementation efforts of its white paper recommendations through its first steering committee meeting earlier this month, the passage of 1755 could present an opportunity for the two endeavors to move forward in some sort of a collaborative or even integrated fashion. Overall, successful implementation of AB 1755 has the long-term potential to strengthen the basis for management decisions and reduce conflict and disagreement. The next two bills I'll mention this morning, which have also been signed by the governor, address the state's water infrastructure relative to climate adaptation. Obviously, this has been a fairly prominent focus of the state in recent years, not only through legislative and administrative means, but also through the ballot, with approximately half of the $7.5 billion approved by voters in Proposition 1 eligible for such adaptation activities. The first bill is AB 2800, a measure by Assemblymember Bill Quirk, a Democrat from Alameda County. The preamble of the bill notes that with the state spending billions of dollars on infrastructure, state engineers should be provided with the most up-to-date and relevant climate science so that such information is considered when establishing design standards. Specifically, the bill requires Resources Agency to establish a working group comprised of professional engineers and representatives from DWR, Caltrans, and General Services that would ultimately be tasked with establishing a process for integrating climate data into state infrastructure projects. While a number of climate adaptation efforts are currently underway, Assemblymember Quirk pointed out that a majority of these efforts approach the issue from a relatively high level, rather than connecting climatologists with on-the-ground engineers to develop more durable standards and policies, as this bill ultimately hopes the working group will lead to. As it relates to the state's water infrastructure, one would presume that the proposed working group would coordinate to the extent feasible with DWR's Climate Change Technical Advisory Group, which currently oversees the modeling of possible climate change impacts on the state's water resources. And the second bill, infrastructure bill that I'll note this afternoon, is more squarely focused on California's natural water infrastructure. AB 2480 by Assemblymember Richard Bloom from Santa Monica would declare that it's the state's policy that source watersheds are important components of California infrastructure, and therefore the maintenance and repair of these watersheds should be eligible for the same financing as other water collection and water treatment infrastructure. The bill goes on to define eligible maintenance and repair activities to include ecosystem restoration and conservation activities. As the council may be aware, AB 2480 was also recently the subject of a Sacramento Bee editorial published last week by current state treasurer John Chung, who expressed his strong support for the measure. In terms of practical impact, while the bill doesn't qualify source watersheds for additional funding in and of itself, it does recognize their importance, and by doing so potentially sets the foundation for these watersheds to receive resources from mechanisms such as revenue bonds and other financing programs going forward. And the final piece of state legislation that I'll highlight is another one that you are certainly familiar with, and that is SB 554 by Senator Lois Wolk, which focuses on DWR's Delta Levees Subventions Program. Under the current parameters of the Levee Subventions Program, the state reimburses up to 75% of costs incurred in excess of $1,000 per levee mile based on an assessment of the local agency's ability to pay. The 75% cost share maximum is scheduled to sunset on July 1st, 2018, thereby reducing the cost share to 50% while reinstituting a $2 million annual reimbursement cap for each local agency. While previous iterations of Senator Wolk's measure would have removed the sunset altogether and made permanent the 75% cost share ceiling, the current version that is before the governor would instead only extend the sunset from 2018 to 2020. As of this afternoon, SB 554 has not been acted upon by the governor. However, should the measure be signed, this would mark the 6th time since the subventions program was created in 1973 that the sunset associated with the cost share portion of the program would be extended. And then finally this morning, turning to news on Capitol Hill, where both the Senate and the House passed their versions of the Water Resources Development Act within the last week. The Water Resources Development Act, more affectionately known by its acronym WRDA, is the main vehicle for authorizing projects to be studied, planned, and developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In addition to including funding for the Flint, Michigan water crisis, the Senate version would authorize the Corps to carry out a variety of projects relative to ecosystem enhancements, navigation, and flood protection across the country. While the Senate's version does not explicitly mention the Delta by name, there are a few sections of the bill that may be of interest. For instance, Section 1027 of the bill relating to levee vegetation clarifies that the Corps may not require or carry out vegetation removal until it issues the new guidelines that were initially required in the 2014 version of WRDA. As the Council may recall, the Delta Plan recommends the Corps exempt Delta levees from its vegetation removal policy, given that such vegetation could add natural channel habitat value. Furthermore, the Senate's version clarifies that the beneficial use of dredged material for habitat restoration would not require the ongoing operation and maintenance that is typically standard for sediment disposal, and with an eye towards the future and our changing climate, the bill directs the EPA in conjunction with Interior, NOAA, and other federal agencies to develop national drought resilience guidelines relating to drought preparedness planning and investments for communities, water utilities, and water users. While the House version tackles a number of similar issues, there are some substantive differences between the two proposals. For example, the House version does not include the levee vegetation proposal included in the Senate version. And also of note, the House version directs the Corps to expedite the completion of its feasibility study for the lower San Joaquin River, and specifically mentions that Reclamation District 17, which covers portions of Lathrop, Manteca, Stockton, and San Joaquin County, should be included in the scope of that assessment. One thing to note here is that the House proposal to include RD 17 runs counter to the tentatively selective plan in the Corps' 2015 interim feasibility report on the lower San Joaquin that specifically excluded RD 17 from the scope of flood project upgrades. With both versions now passed by their respective houses, compromise bill negotiations on crafting a compromise will begin through the conference committee process, with a final agreement not expected until after the November election. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ryan. Questions of Ryan? Remind us again what happens if a bill is not signed.
If a bill is not signed, then it would become law by default. Yeah.
And that date is?
And that date is tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. You said that and I didn't hear it, so
Certainly.
My apologies.
Not at all.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, the remaining item on today's agenda after we conclude our lead scientist report is going to be on single-year water transfers and the amendment to the Delta Plan. During that item, which is kind of a multi-step item, council members will be asked to determine CEQA exemption and to adopt the CEQA addendum to the Delta Plan programmatic EIR, as well as amendments to the Delta Plan's implementing regulations and to a Delta Plan recommendation, and a portion of that item includes a public hearing. And then tomorrow on the agenda, we will be exploring two other Delta Plan future amendments, one on conveyance, storage, and operations, and staff will have a presentation of some analysis for you there, and we hope to get some further direction on next steps for that. And then also we'll hear from some panelists on the foundational work that's informing a future ecosystem amendment to the Delta Plan. And with that, I conclude my executive officer's report.
Any questions of Jessica? Okay, great. Then we are, any public comment on file item number 7? None. On to file item number 8, lead scientist report. Dr. Cliff Dahm.
So I have a number of activities and science papers that I wanted to bring to your attention today. The first one is the item that Jessica Pearson just mentioned. We commissioned a peer review on estimating net delta outflow. Net delta outflow is a value that we would like to know, but it's extremely hard to measure. And let me explain why that is. In the Delta, when you have a variety of riverine sources coming into the Delta, and you meet with the substantive tidal action that exists within the Delta, those twice daily flows in and out of the Delta of tidal water are, in periods of lower flow for your rivers, 20 to 30 times what is actually coming through by riverine input. And the actual then quantification of how much of that water ends up in a variety of different potential sinks, like being used by agricultural interests in the Delta, being taken out for various municipal uses, being sent to the pumps for transfer down to Southern California or the Central Valley. All of these are things that are quantified. There's error associated with every one of these quantifications. There's error associated with the gauges that actually gauge how much river water comes into the Delta. And then you add this massively large component of tidal water moving in and out of the Delta twice a day. And actually determining what net Delta outflow is a technically very difficult challenge. And so the peer review panel was asked to basically provide an update on methods that are being used to estimate, evaluate those methods, and also summarize some of the key things that hopefully are uncertainties that we could reduce moving forward, possibly with new technology. That report just arrived 2 days ago, and so we've just begun the process of taking a quick look at it. We don't make any changes to the report other than just grammatical or making it look nicer. That'll be issued fairly soon. The 4 reviewers that were brought together to actually do this peer review include someone that some of you here on the council will know very well. Peter Goodwin was one of the 4 panelists. In addition, Bill Fleener, who's a retired hydrologist at UC Davis, Kathy Rule, who's with the USGS Water Science Center, and Nancy Monson, who's a private engineering consultant, were the 4 panelists that carried out this review. And so the review has been received. We're going to, I think we're going to put it out for public viewing very shortly. And again, nice, thorough. I thought I had a chance to just skim through it here yesterday, and I think they've got some pretty good ideas. The one I wanted to highlight to you directly is one of the uncertainties that does affect our ability to estimate net delta outflow accurately is the amount of water that is being used within the delta. And some of you may remember that the Delta Water Master, Michael George, has come in and briefed you a couple of times on some of his recent activities. One of his big efforts, one of his major goals here, I think, moving forward is to do a better job of basically understanding the internal water budget of the Delta. And so he's been doing a project that uses about 8 different methodologies to try to determine how much water is being used within the Delta during different times of the year, in different locations within the Delta, and that's one of the terms that fits into this net Delta outflow, is getting that number accurate. So I think there will be some interesting synergy with this report and with the efforts to determine net Delta use more efficiently, and coming up with better estimates of net Delta outflow. Net Delta outflow affects the salinity structure. In our last panel, we talked about what the salt dynamics look like in the western part of the Delta, and this is part of the series of measurements necessary to actually begin to calculate salinity patterns in the western Delta is knowing what this net Delta outflow value actually is. And so that's why this was, I think, a useful and an important review to be done by this panel. So.
If I might add also, we are co-funding that consumptive use study that's being led by the Delta Water Master.
Yeah, we're one of a number of different entities that are supporting that effort. And we have one of our staff, I know, following closely what's being done. Okay, so that's that's a peer review report that's just been received and will be posted shortly. I have 4. I was a little bit generous this time around. I gave you 4 different publications, 2 that I had promised and 2 others that I just couldn't stop myself from adding to the list of things to share with you. The first one, I think you'll understand why I selected it. This is a paper published in 2015. The title of the paper is Fish Hatchery Genetic Management Techniques, Integrating Theory with Implementation. The lead author is Kathleen M. Fish. Seems reasonably appropriate that we'd have a study by F-I-S-C-H, the German spelling of fish. Anyway, Kathleen Fish, the lead author, performed this research while she was a Delta Science Fellow. So money that you approved supported this woman's research. This report was recently recognized by the American Fisheries Society as the best genetics paper published in any of the AFS journals, so it's already has won a very nice award. And just want to commend you all for allowing these young scholars to do their work, and here's one of the products that I thought you might be interested in seeing. Let me try to highlight some of the main points of this paper. I am not a fish geneticist, so I will do my best. But what Kathleen did was really a very detailed survey of the literature worldwide, looking at how fish hatcheries are run and the kind of ways that they try to maintain genetic diversity within the stocks. So probably most of you are more familiar with the kind of hatcheries that supplement fish numbers for often recreational or commercial harvest. But increasingly worldwide, we also have hatcheries that are being utilized to sustain threatened and endangered species. And that's certainly true, for example, of the Delta Smelt here in California. It's also very true of the Rio Grande silvery minnow from my home back in New Mexico. There are 3 hatcheries that actually are actively maintaining this population, and actually they are doing active reintroduction of these fish from these 3 facilities. Some of the things that are really important to make these work well is that you need to maintain an effective population size of the organism that you're trying to preserve and conserve. You need to minimize inbreeding within the population. So you want to basically maintain as much genetic diversity as you possibly can. And the other thing that you want to do in these facilities is you don't want them to become acclimated to being in captivity. So as much as possible, you want to try to keep some of the wild attributes of these fish active in their genomic structure. So these are some of the things that Kathleen and her co-authors pointed out are some of the goals. They went around the world looking at how these are being implemented in different places, where they're having success, where they're not having success. And basically the paper, I think, is a very nice survey. I was looking at one of her key tables. She certainly looks at the use of conservation hatcheries here in the United States, but these are actually getting applied in other places around the world. So she had some nice examples also where they're using this same type of technology, for example, in Southeast Asia, to maintain some of the populations, for example, in many of the big rivers of the Southeast Asia where high human pressure on populations have caused some number of key populations to now be, again, in very threatened conditions. So a nice paper, nice, well-researched and well-written paper, and a byproduct of your support. So wanted to highlight that. Questions about it?
Cliff, the earlier discussion between you and Carl Wilcox about using captive fish, and I think you alluded or in your discussion that there's controversy about doing that. How do you relate, this research with kind of your back and forth with him on that?
The research here is really focused mostly on maintaining as much diversity as is possible in the captively bred populations, with the idea that they potentially could then be used in the future for trying to either sustain or recover a fish population. The paper is not focused on actually doing that. It's actually focused on how to manage the hatcheries correctly.
Right, but is there a resistance on the part of DFW?
I can't speak for their agency, but I know that anywhere in the world where you talk about doing these kind of things, there is controversy as to whether or not you try to recover the current wild population versus trying to recover using a captively bred population. And it's a tough decision. There's good arguments on both sides of that ledger. So, I think right now the hope is with the Delta smelt is that we can recover the remaining wild population, but I think more and more you're going to hear people discussing whether or not captive breeding and reintroduction is a pathway we'll need to consider, but certainly we haven't made that decision yet.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on this paper? Okay, the next paper is one that is a topic also of considerable interest, and we've also spoken a little bit about this already today, and that is a paper by Hans Perl and colleagues on mitigating cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms in aquatic ecosystems impacted by climate change and by anthropogenic nutrients. And I picked this paper for a couple reasons. One, it's a very new review article on this topic. Secondly, harmful algal blooms very much in the news here in California, throughout the United States, worldwide. And so Hans Perl is one of the leaders in this. We've used him as a peer reviewer a couple times in some review panels that we've had over the years. And I thought that he and his colleagues have done a nice job of highlighting some of the issues, which I'd like to try to bring to your attention about these organisms. And so part of what we were discussing before lunch was the desire to have algal blooms of certain types of algae, but not to have algal blooms of some of these organisms that are of concern. And many of these organisms, but not all, are cyanobacteria. So when we say they're algae, that's really an incorrect nomenclature. They're really bacteria. But the harmful algal blooms are increasing worldwide. There are multiple factors that are causing that increase. And this paper tries to highlight a few of them, and I wanted to try to share a couple things with you that I think hopefully will be of interest. So when you think about harmful algal blooms and their increasing both the intensity and the duration and the extent of coverage, these are some of the things that are being documented globally. There are certain drivers that are affecting this. And so one of the first, I think, easy to remember things about many of these harmful algal blooming organisms is they like it hot. And so there's a famous paper in Science a few years ago, Some Like It Hot, and it's all about cyanobacteria blooms. So warm water temperatures generally are conducive for the development of these kind of organisms. So that's, and Hans Perl was, by the way, was one of the two authors on that paper. So that's one factor. Another factor is they need to have enough sunlight. So you're going to, so basically they do well in warm, sunny days. So that's the kind of weather pattern that seems to be conducive for their growth. Those are things that have been known for a long time. In addition, they need nutrients. They need the kind of resources, both in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, that can stimulate their growth. Many of the harmful algal blooms that we face worldwide are actually organisms that can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and actually get their nitrogen directly from the air. This is not true of the microcystis. That's a problem here in the Delta, but in other parts of the world, some of the harmful algal blooms are nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. And so they overcome that nutrient requirement for nitrogen, so they tend to be particularly problematic where there is phosphorus pollution getting into the water. So in many areas of the world, if there's a lot of phosphorus in the water, that'll select for some of these cyanobacteria when it forms when it gets warm, and they then have a way of overcoming that nitrogen deficiency. Not an issue for the microcystis that's such a concern in the Delta. The other thing that they like is they're not the fastest growing organisms. They actually grow reasonably slowly compared to the bloom organisms we talked about today, the diatoms that we talked about today. So they do like stagnant water conditions. So one of the things that promotes many of these harmful algal blooms is not a lot of mixing, not a lot of movement of the water. And so one of the things that commonly often gets done to try to remediate some of these problems is to provide aeration or move that water around. There's a couple other things that have also come to light recently, which I think is a little newer research that might be of interest to you, and that is there's growing evidence, and this is mostly evidence from Jeff Huisman at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, who's also another leader on this topic. It appears that the increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere may be having a direct effect on these organisms. So as we add more and more CO2 to the atmosphere, that CO2 dissolves in the water. Most of you have probably heard about it as a problem as it affects ocean acidification, but it also just is a source of carbon dioxide. And it turns out that many of these cyanobacterial organisms in their bloom state are really good scavengers of CO2. And so that's one of the ways they kind of get a leg up on everybody else, and that's why they become these dense colonies of these harmful algal blooms. But the fact that they're having a ready supply of carbon dioxide, more so than they used to have a few decades ago, moving from the atmosphere into the water, means that they're also able to get that CO2 more easily. And so that too may be another part of the emerging puzzle as to why these organisms are doing so well just about anywhere in the world that we look for them. So this is a nice article that that summarizes some of these key things, and also talks a little bit about how you might mitigate. There are some things that are being tested. None of them are really large scale; they're mostly small scale. I've mentioned the movement, trying to keep the water moving, is another one that's actually been tried a lot in the Netherlands, where they have a lot of these harmful algal blooms. Is actually they add a very dilute solution of hydrogen peroxide to the water, and that actually appears to knock back some of the cyanobacteria. It's only been done at a very small scale. This is not something that is probably going to work at the scale of the big kinds of blooms we've been seeing in the Delta, for example. But that's an interesting thing that has been tried with some success in the Netherlands. So anyway, this paper is highlighting the information that exists on cyanobacterial blooms, and one of the other things that I wanted to add that's in this paper, and that is there's also a growing interest, and this is where it really impinges upon human health, is what is it that controls how much of these toxins that many of these organisms produce? What are some of the controls over how much of the toxins? So not only are we seeing the distribution of these blooms increasing worldwide, we're also seeing in many cases where the toxin levels are also increasing. And so an understanding of that interaction between bloom and toxin formation is a big active area of research. So, and I think an important one, because when these kinds of conditions start to emerge, it becomes very quickly a public health issue, and getting warnings out, getting people keep their pets out of these waters, things like that are also very important. And so it's it's a combination of both whether the organism is blooming, but it's also whether these toxins are present and at what levels. So that's another aspect of this paper that I think is worth highlighting. So that's the second paper. Any questions on this one? All right, I will move. Questions? Nothing. All right, so then I'm going to move on to two more papers that were published in the last issue of the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences. These are the two more papers that are part of the State of Bay Delta Science review and summary papers. Last council meeting, I talked to you about the Delta Smelt paper and about the Salmonid paper. The two I want to highlight today is the paper on predation, and the second one I want to highlight is the paper on viewing the Delta from a landscape ecology perspective. So those are the two papers. This finishes up the four papers that were in that initial issue. The next issue that will have some additional papers that are part of the State of Bay Delta Science series will be coming out, I believe, in a couple weeks in October. Let me start with the predation paper. The predation paper is written by Gary Grossman. Gary Grossman is at the University of Georgia, an expert on predation. Recently actually testified before Congress on this topic. And used some of the materials that are found in this chapter that he recently wrote. So what he did is he looked at the different categories of predators in the Delta. He looked at the different prey species that these predators utilize. And he basically came away with a series of really 5 take-home points that I'd like to highlight to you from the article. The first one is that these predator and prey relationships they're not static. They change dynamically through time and in space. And there's a great deal of uncertainty surrounding predation in the Delta. It remains an area that is not settled science. There's a lot of questions. For example, there's a question about the role that contaminants might play in actually setting the stage for predation to occur. So if you have stressed organisms that are being affected by contaminants, they often are more susceptible to predation. I liken this in some ways to some of the forest dieback we see in our forests. We know that what's killing those trees are bark beetles, but the bark beetles the stage is being set by the drought. So there is this kind of chicken and egg kind of issue about what is the proximate cause versus the ultimate cause, and this is a point that Gary makes in his paper. Predation involves several components which are affected by a variety of changes that have occurred in the Delta. There is definitely a spatial pattern to it. And one of the things that this paper goes on to do is actually to identify 13 hotspots of high predation pressure within the Delta. So I think we've been talking about what to do about predation. There's certainly a diversity of opinions on what to do about predation. The fact that this paper's gone through the effort of actually identifying these 13 hotspots within the Delta, I think is potentially a vehicle, if we really do want to do adaptive management experimentation, is to actually see whether in some of these selected hotspots predation can be affected by any of a variety of management pathways. So, this is something where this paper, I think, does a very nice service by actually showing where there are locations where predation is especially high. And the reason that we're beginning to get information like this is because of the acoustic tagging technology that now allows you to put small tags in many of these fish species and actually follow their movement through the Delta, and actually, in many cases, even determine exactly where they're predated upon, so where the predation actually occurs. And that's how they've been able to map these hotspots that are there. A third point is that the majority of predatory fish identified within the Delta are invasive species, and most of the non-fish predators were native species, and most of the prey fishes consumed were actually also invasive species. So you've got a lot of invasive predators eating a lot of invasive non-predators. Okay, so a lot of the food web involves, and that may be not entirely surprising because the numbers of non-native species are much higher than the native species in many areas of the Delta. So that's another point, take-home point that he had. And then the last one has to do with management strategies, and his point was that the control of invasive predatory fish is a common management strategy, but in looking at the applications around the United States, which he focuses on in this paper, it is a mixed bag as to whether it's been successful or not successful. So he basically, his bottom line is that there have been studies where predators are removed, and what that does is just induce more predators even than you had before to come back into it. But then there's been some places where they've had predator control over the long term that's actually had some positive effects in the work. So the literature is not of one mind on this topic, and you'll get different opinions depending on where the specific place, the specific predators that are present and the prey species that they're predating on. So those are some of the key take-homes from that. Question? Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, that last point, that kind of struck me in your summary, that you had this uptick in salmon and on the first removal of the predator, and then you didn't because these other predators moved in, and then that, I mean, does that argue to sort of habitat as the way to reduce predation, or are we just overwhelmed with the numbers of predatory fish in the Delta?
Well, I'll just highlight that that's one study in one place.
Okay.
And so whether this is a generalizable result, I don't know. I think that's where I would argue that the fact that we have identified hotspots of predation would make it possible to actually do some controlled experimentation within that. There's been some interesting work on predation on salmonids, and the interim IEP lead scientist before his departure to Woods Hole gave us a very, very nice summary. I think a number of us have seen this, seen his presentation on this topic. And one of the things that he was able to do is actually tether small salmon and actually link them to cameras and actually watch them as they move through the Delta and actually see which kind of predators were most likely to attack the juvenile salmon. The thing that for me was an interesting take-home is that the one group of organisms that has not been highlighted as much as a predatory pressure on these populations was that some of the catfish species were pretty active in predation. So anyway, I would argue we just don't know enough to embark on a major effort, but I think this is a great example where some adaptive management experimentation could potentially increase our knowledge and help us make decisions as to what our strategies going forward should be.
Would you call that a high priority for research?
It would be, personally, I think it's an important area of research. And it's not just important research in the Delta, it also is, I think, an important research topic in many of the tributary streams. And actually, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife has actually just funded some, at least 3 studies I know that are focused entirely on predation. So there is some emerging effort being put into this topic.
Okay, thank you.
Cliff?
Next one.
I was just going to say, one of the things I noted in the predation report was how quickly the bass can attack that tethered juvenile salmon. Quicker than a Bob Feller fastball. So I'm not sure we could ever get enough flow to push the salmon faster than the bass can react.
So the next State of Bay Delta Science paper that I wanted to briefly discuss with you is a paper that was written by John Wiens and his co-authors, actually Letitia Grenier and Robin Grossinger, who are from SFEI, from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and Michael Healy, who is a former lead scientist for the science program. The 4 of them have written a paper that's entitled "The Delta as Changing Landscapes." Robin Grossinger, the co-author on this paper, he and his group and his colleagues did I think a phenomenal historical ecology effort to reconstruct the conditions that existed in the Delta pre-coming of European peoples to this area. And this kind of information is what you'll often hear people referring to as sort of the historical baseline. It is something that provides, I think, guidance. We're never going to go back to the historical Delta. We probably never could go back to the historical Delta, but the historical Delta did have structure to it, and they have done a wonderful job of spatially delineating the structural elements of the Delta. And so the Delta, I mean, it was not just one big wetland. It had a lot of other structural components that you find distributed in different parts of the overall Delta. So, for example, in the Sacramento River portion of the Delta, there were natural levees, and so there was a lot of leveed areas. Those leveed areas were areas where there was a lot of riparian vegetation that was growing on that. You had more of the central Delta, where it was more of a tidal marsh-dominated system with lots of tules and things like that. It turns out that the San Joaquin system in its lower part of the river was a distributary system, and when I use the word distributary, I mean that the water came in and then actually went out in multiple channels in multiple directions. It was also an area where a lot of woody material, a lot of trees and downed wood accumulated, so there was this massive amount of organic matter just basically sitting at the lower ends of the San Joaquin River. And so knowing a little something about the structural elements in different parts of the Delta is something that this group I know is very actively promoting as something that should be good background information for people that are designing restoration projects. So they should know a little something about what kind of a environment, what kind of a habitat existed a couple hundred years ago, and try to the degree they can, link some of those past structural elements to maybe designing and determining what actually is feasible moving forward for a habitat restoration project. So these are leaders and people in doing that. John Wiens is a member of our Delta Independent Science Board. He is often referred to as the person who put landscape ecology on the map here in the United States, and he thinks about these kind of things. His work is focused and has always focused on terrestrial ecosystems. That's his area. But we have been drawing him in more and more to think about how the interface between aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems play out in the Delta. And so John and his co-authors here have written a thoughtful piece, more of a conceptual piece. I've got a couple take-home points that I thought was worth sharing with you. So one of them is what I just tried to say, the historical ecology perspective, using the knowledge of past landscape functions, can contribute to the restoration and management of contemporary landscapes. So that's one of the key points. Another one of the key points is that the concepts and tools that have been developed in the field of landscape ecology are becoming increasingly well developed, but they need to be applied as part of an approach that enhances the effectiveness of management, conservation, and restoration. And to do that, they have some ideas as to how best to do that. But three things that resonated with me in their list was one is foster interagency collaboration. So a lot of these things could benefit from people from different agencies discussing some of these historical structures and current structures, and maybe what we might design for 2050 or some future time relative to some of the key attributes of habitat within the Delta. And then the other thing is to use spatial analysis in landscape maps. And so the spatial analysis basically means you're just cognizant of where you are and how you're connected to other parts of the landscape. And so one of the major themes of landscape ecology is the connectivity between land and water, or the connectivity between one part of a waterway and another part, and how these hydrodynamically link each other together, and how the flows of both living organisms and some of the physical and chemical processes and chemical attributes link up within a landscape perspective. So that is the last of the 4 papers that were in this most recent issue of the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Sciences Journal. There will be 3 more coming out shortly, and then 6 more coming out in December. So just to let you know that you will see more of these, and I will try my best to highlight some of the key points from some of the individual papers. And certainly I encourage you all to read them. I know that some of you have, and some of you come and chatted with me about having read some of the papers, and I think that's a great way to dialogue with some of these authors and think about some of the ideas.
Speaking of which, one of the authors will be here tomorrow on our ecosystem amendment discussion, Letitia Greiner.
Oh, good, great. Okay, the other thing is we had a brown bag seminar and that I found fascinating, and I thought it would be worthwhile to highlight a few things. There's some more linkages here. The presenter was Michael Dettinger. Michael Dettinger is one of the 3 co-editors of the State of Bay Delta Science. Okay, so what a tangled web we weave here. Mike is a climatologist. Mike is an outstanding climatologist. Mike Dettinger is probably, most of you, his awareness of some of his work is probably in some of those wonderful graphics that he produced showing just how variable precipitation and stream flow is in California. So he wrote a very interesting paper in 2011 that basically pointed out that throughout all of the 48 contiguous states in the lower 48 of the United States, California, and particularly Southern California, is the bullseye for the greatest variability, both in precipitation on a year-by-year basis and also in stream flow. And so Mike's question he's been asking here of late and that he's been researching is deconstructing the current California drought. And drought is an interesting word. We all use it. I think some of us, when we say drought, might be thinking of drought as it relates to a lack of precipitation. Other people might say drought, and it's really how much water do we have in storage in our reservoirs. Others might, a farmer might be interested in drought is what's that mean to soil moisture, to how much moisture we have available to grow our crops. There's a variety of attributes that link to the word drought, and what Mike wanted to do in his seminar was just to basically talk about this drought and really how intense this drought is over the last 5 years for some of these things that we can measure. And so some of the things that he pointed out is that over this last 5 years, we're about 1.25 years below average in precipitation. But we're 2.5 to 2.8 years behind in terms of snowpack. So this is a drought that has produced lower amounts of precipitation, but even lower amounts of snow. And this is a byproduct of the fact that we're getting more rain and less snow in our mountains. And so that's one of the other things. It's about a 2-year drought when you look at stream flow. And so stream flow, when we talk about water budgets and we talk about inflows and outflows to the delta, this is also being manifest just in stream flow from our source waters when you go up into the headwaters. So he did this analysis for a variety of different parts of the overall water budget. And then at the end of his seminar, he threw in a little bit more information on what we know from the 2016 water year, which we're not yet quite through, but he just wanted to let people know that he's also thinking about the continuation. And certainly one of the reasons for doing that is to just let everybody know that the drought didn't break with the big giant El Nino. Regrettably, we didn't get the water we had hoped for. There's been some alleviation of some aspects of drought conditions in the northern part of the Sierras, but not in the southern part of the Sierras. And he basically just let us know that we really are in a 5-year drought. And we'll see what this next year brings. But his idea, and I thought a very nice one, is to try to put all of these types of drought into one kind of common currency, and that is basically how much of a deficit do we have based on these 5 years of drought condition. And so some of the numbers are in your report, but this is something that he's thinking about, and I suspect he will be writing up shortly. But it was, I thought, an interesting and useful seminar. There's a poster out there for you to look at if you're interested. This is actually a poster from the Independent Science Board's meeting on seismic hazards and flood hazards. It's a poster from a group of researchers at UCLA. They've been looking at seismic deformation potential on peats in levees. They've been doing some laboratory experiments. These are preliminary data that they've been getting. They've also been working with some researchers in Hokkaido, Japan, where there's also peat soil levees. And one of the things that they have found is that during a seismic event, one of the things that does happen, not immediately, but over a year or two after the seismic event, is a deformation process. And that deformation process would potentially produce some settling on the order of some tenths of meters or a few inches that would be a byproduct of a seismic event. So all of the effects might not be instantaneous. There might be some delayed effects also on levees that are built on peat basis. So this is, I think, a new piece of research that we don't have much information on. Finally, I have 2 announcements that I wanted to share with you. The first one is the Science Enterprise Workshop, which has been a effort that has been led by Jessica Law from our shop and by Mike Chkowski from the U.S. Geological Survey. This is a workshop that's going to be held on the 1st and 2nd of November. It's a workshop really to bring together people from 6 large-scale complex ecosystem study groups, including Everglades, Chesapeake Bay, Great Lakes, coastal Louisiana, Puget Sound, and California Bay Delta, for a workshop to really talk about how the science enterprise has been structured, what kinds of things that they're doing, the history of developing the scientific questions, how it's funded, who's engaged, what agencies are involved, a variety of things. So this is something that's been a major effort that both Jessica and Mike have been pursuing avidly. And we just wanted to let you know that the registration will open tomorrow. And there will be a small registration fee for the workshop, $55. We would love to have a broad participation from both Delta scientists, but also Delta policy and Delta management folk. And the website tomorrow should have that announcement, and you'll probably get pinged about the announcement. So I wanted to highlight that we're getting close to those dates, and there will be the 2-day workshop at UC Davis on the 1st and the 2nd. And I think when the announcement comes out, there will also be agenda, and so you get an idea of the structure. First day is going to focus on some information from the 6 sites. Second day is going to focus more on some then discussions of this science policy interface in a variety of different facets. So just to let you know that we're about to announce that. And then finally, this is as much to solicit your thoughts and ideas, but the National Research Council has just opened a call for nominations for a new review that the National Research Council. So the National Research Council is a branch of the National Academies, which includes the National Academies of Science, the National Academy of Medicine, and the National Academy of Engineering. The NRC is going to have, looking for nominations for a new project which is called the 2016-17 Grand Challenges and Opportunities in Environmental Engineering and Science for the 21st Century. This is the kind of thing that the NRC often does. They try to be forward-looking about what are some of our needs as a nation going forward in key areas of science and engineering. This Grand Challenges and Opportunities in Environmental Engineering and Science is something that the former lead scientist, Peter Goodwin, felt passionately about, that California needs to get more involved in these kind of national efforts, and we need to get Californians on these panels. And so the call for nominations is now open. We're wanting to nominate 4 or 6 Californians that are interested in environmental engineering, science, and science policy. And if any of you have ideas, be really interested in your thoughts. We've got a list that we're thinking of. We have to get the nominations in by October the 10th, so that is our deadline. Ultimately, the nominations that they get will be then, they'll be selecting the panel. We have been guaranteed that one of the panel meetings will be here. We'll be here in this part of California. So one of the things that we hope to do is highlight some of the complex environmental engineering and sciences challenges in the Bay Delta system. And so ideas for people that you have dealt with or worked with or you think would be good. They don't pay you anything. It is basically they pay your expenses to participate. But it's an opportunity to shape the future of science and engineering in this field moving forward, and we're pleased to be a participant in this process. And so, just wanted to tell you that that's something that we need to get acting on because the 10th will be here soon. So any questions? I think those are the main things I wanted to bring to your attention. The last thing is by the numbers, and we'll invite Laura and Yamani to come up and speak to you. But if you have any questions of me before she gets up, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Any questions of Cliff? Certainly covered a lot of information today. We appreciate it. It's all useful and good and interesting.
Lauren, it is yours. Take it over.
All right. Okay, good afternoon, Chair Fiorini and council members. Let's see. So I'd like to start today's by the numbers, noting that tomorrow is the final day of the water year. And so this year's cumulative precipitation serves as the total for the year. So we'll be starting with new precipitation numbers next month. We received only an additional 1/10 of an inch of rain in the Northern Sierra from last month, and this puts the Northern Sierra at 116% of its average to date. We also received no additional rain for the Central Sierra, and thus the Central Sierra for the water year ends at 98% of its average to date. For water supply, reservoir storage at Shasta dropped by 6% of its average to date, but still remains above 100%. Oroville dropped a similar amount for this last month, but this pushes it from a fair to a poor rating. San Luis Reservoir continues to fill. It's up by about 20% of its average to date, but still has a long way to go. So this month, it moves from a rating of bad to poor. In terms of flow is pretty comparable to last month, with Sacramento River at Freeport showing only a 2% decline in average water flow to date, and flow for San Joaquin at Vernalis continues to be quite bad. It increased only about 30 cubic feet per second from last month. It's at just 15% of its 20-year September average. Flow at the Central Valley and State Water Project pumps continues to be good, now above 100% of the average for this time of year. Salinity doesn't show too many marked changes, except for an increase in salinity at Banks. This moves the water quality rating from good last month to fair this month. And at that site, salinity increased by a little over 200 salinity units. Okay, so now on to some fish numbers. Going back to green sturgeon, we discussed them briefly at the last council meeting. But as you may recall, we were waiting on some more solid data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who provided us with this time series of the green sturgeon relative abundance index. So this data comes from rotary screw trap sampling. It's conducted mostly for juvenile salmon at Red Bluff Diversion Dam, but it also incidentally catches these juvenile green sturgeon. So this year's index of abundance is about 30 fish per acre foot sampled. This is about 10 times the 20-year median value for the survey, which began in 1995. As a caveat, this index of abundance for 2016 only includes those juveniles caught through the end of July, but it's not expected to increase too much more for the rest of the year. Although everyone thinks that this tenfold increase is probably a positive sign for green sturgeon, it was emphasized in previous reports that increases in the juveniles caught in the rotary screw traps doesn't necessarily translate into similar increases in the number of adult sturgeon. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, thanks for your time, and this concludes by the numbers.
Through the chair, if I could ask a quick question maybe of Cliff. Sturgeon, I believe, are a native fish?
The two species of sturgeon are natives.
Okay, thank you.
So what was the big bump between 2015 and 16 for sturgeon? Is it just the water conditions where, they thrive in higher flow conditions, or?
I'm not sure that it's known at this point.
I've heard some suggestion that juvenile survival is higher than it's been lately. The mechanism behind that,
Who knows?
don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be statistically significant.
Yeah,
but,
no, it's a positive sign.
Yes.
Take it as a positive sign.
And there's not a whole lot of those, so you need to relish them. I've been kind of watching the Shasta levels over the last few months, and definitely there's got to be a connection between what they're keeping in Shasta and what's been in San Luis. Is that the cold water pool that they're kind of hanging on to for a longer period? Because typically they all start to get into flood control mode in September. That's,
Yeah. I am not certain about that as well. Does Cliff have any input?
Yeah, I mean, my suspicion is you're probably right, that some aspect of this is operations, so that they have they want to have more carryover of the cold water storage, because they don't want to end up in situations like they've had in previous years where they ran out of cold water. But I think this is something we should ask the operations folks. I'm sure they have information on this.
It's been interesting because they've not been allocating to the farmers, my understanding. So, last quick question on this. You display salinity in electrical conductivity units. Is there a reason you chose that over total dissolved solids?
It's what's directly measured by the sensors that we report. Would you like a conversion to salinity or to TDS? We can do that.
Kind of. I think most people relate to that more. I know I relate to that more. I mean, I can kind of figure this out, but
yeah, I'm so used to using these automated sondes that provide data in this that I think in microsiemens per centimeter, but I probably am not. I'm probably the rarity, not the. We could certainly provide a conversion for you if you'd like.
okay. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Cliff, anything else?
No, that concludes the lead scientist report.
Okay, thank you very much. That concludes file item number 8. Any requests for public comment? Very good. File item number 9 we covered this morning. File item number 10 has been deleted from today's agenda. So the next item up will be file item 11, and as I mentioned earlier, we want to time this so that we give opportunity for public comment up to 5 p.m. So panel, relax. We're gonna recess. But before we do, I need to take a survey. How many of you in the audience are here to provide public comment on the single-year water transfers matter? So how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So figure 15 minutes for that. How long for the staff report? About 15 minutes? Okay, so we are now in recess until 4:30. Be back here at 4:30. Reconvene. Thank you for those of you that have been patient enough to stick around to accommodate the schedule for file item number 11. I am Randy Fiorini, Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, and I will be acting as today's hearing officer. It is 4:28 on Thursday, September 29th, 2016, and we are here today at the Park Tower Plaza, second floor conference center, 989th Street in Sacramento, California, to receive public comments orally and/or in writing on the proposed Delta Plan Amendment, single-year water transfers, notice of which has previously been published and sent by mail to interested parties pursuant to the California Administrative Procedure Act. The initial 45-day written comment period required by the Administrative Procedure Act closed on September 6, 2016. On September 14, 2016, we opened a subsequent 15-day comment period for the public to review documents from our 2015 meetings that we added to the rulemaking record. That 15-day comment period closes today at 5 p.m. The purpose of this hearing is to receive public testimony. Witnesses presenting testimony will not be sworn in, but council members and staff may respond to comments. We will take under submission all written and oral statements submitted or made during this hearing. We will also respond to rulemaking comments in writing in the final statement of reasons. The entire hearing will be recorded by a certified court reporter. She's located over here to my left. So you'll have to speak very clearly. The transcript of the hearing and all written materials presented during the hearing will be made part of the rulemaking record as appropriate. If you wish to provide testimony, we ask that you fill out a blue speaker card. If you do not wish to provide testimony but would like to receive notices related to the rulemaking process, we would ask that you fill out the attendance sheet at the side table, the table to our left. If you wish to submit written comments at this meeting, please give them to Pat Rogers, Pat, wave, or Amanda Bowl, who is not here right now, who seated at the side table. And we will also accept written comments until 5 p.m. today at our offices at 989th Street, the 15th floor of this building, Sacramento. Electronic transmittals of comments can be submitted until 5 p.m. today to the following address: OAL_amend single, AMENDSINGLE at deltacouncil.ca.gov. Does anybody need me to repeat that? Okay, thank you. We will listen to public testimony in the order we receive the completed blue speaker cards. After we hear from everyone who has filled out a speaker card, we will hear from any latecomers or anyone else who wishes to be heard. We reserve the right to impose reasonable time limitations on oral testimony, and in the interest of time, respectfully request that you not repeat written comments you have or will submit. Similarly, if you agree with comments made by a prior speaker, simply state that fact and add any new information that you feel is pertinent to the issue. Finally, when you come to speak, we ask that you do certain things so that the council, audience, and court reporter may hear you, and so that your comments are entered into the records and responded to appropriately. First, we ask you to come to the microphone, which is here at the podium, when you're called to speak. Second, please begin by stating your name and identifying the organization you represent, if any. Prior to receiving testimony, I'm going to hold off on that right now. We have our panel before us to provide a review of the information that has been assembled, and then I will call upon the public for comment, and then the council will deliberate. So that's the process. So Anthony, you are the staff lead on this matter. You've put a lot of work, a lot of effort into it, as have those of you seated at the table. So look forward to hearing your brief staff report.
Thank you. I will try to make it brief. I want to thank the council members and Chairman Fiorini for the opportunity to present this agenda item and present the folks at the table who will assist in responding to any questions from the council and the public. To my left is Mr. Stephen Hatchett, is CHM Hill's project manager for the regulation amendment effort with the Office of Administrative Law. To my right is Ms. Gwendolyn Buchholz. She is CHM Hill's project manager for CEQA analysis. To her right is Ms. Ellen Garber. She is from Shute, Mahaley, and Weinberg LLP and is the council's CEQA consultant. And to the far right, Mr. Jeremy Brown is from the State Attorney General's Office and the council's legal counsel. The agenda item is staff's opportunity to make recommendations to the Delta Plan for the 2 single-year water transfers amendments. We will provide information on the background, development process, and ultimately the recommendation for the proposed amendments as a comprehensive resolution at the end of this process. I'll begin with historical background. The Delta Reform Act under Water Code 85300 established the Delta Stewardship Council, defined the co-equal goals, and directed the council to develop an enforceable, comprehensive, and long-term management plan for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is the Delta Plan. The Delta Reform Act mandated that a state or local agency which proposes to undertake a covered action which may have a significant impact towards the achievement of the co-equal goals must prepare a written certification of consistency with the Delta Plan. Although the Delta Reform Act did not define covered actions that have significant impact on the co-equal goals, in 2013, the council adopted regulations to define the term significant impact. Under that definition, the definition included 4 categories of exempt projects that were determined not to have a significant impact. One of those categories is temporary water transfers of up to 1 year in duration. At the time, the council made the determination of this category was an influential tool for the water managers to have a more reliable water supply. Yet the council heard testimony of concern that there may be impacts to the Delta ecosystem due to such transactions. Thus, the council developed the regulation that the category would be exempt until the sunset date of December 31st, 2016, to provide the council staff the time to collect information and have testimony to the effects of the single-year water transfers on the Delta ecosystem. The 2015 effort. In 2015, the council identified the issue as a priority. Council staff had coordinated with state regulatory agencies such as the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board, who provided information on water transfers through testimony and at the September 24, 2015 council meeting, as well as through documents such as a report on water transfers and the Delta Plan and a December 2015 draft water transfer white paper. Both agencies summarize recent improvements in transparency in review and processing of single-year water transfers. Further analysis presented during those hearings included a summary of the best available science relative to such transfers. At the November and December 2015 council meetings, staff presented options to the council. Option 1, exempt single-year water transfers from regulation and delete the sunset date as a covered action. Option 2, take no action and allow exemption to expire after the sunset date. And option 1A, preserve the current exemption for an additional 3 years. At that meeting, the council adopted draft policy 1 to remove the sunset date and revised WRR 15, as well as directed council staff to perform a CEQA review effort and engage with the Office of Administrative Law to amend regulation. Now I'll go in a summary of the CEQA review effort. In early 2016, council staff and our consultants began a preliminary CEQA analysis of potential environmental impacts resulting from the proposed project. A prerequisite to the Delta Plan Programmatic EIR addendum was that staff was not aware of any significant impacts of the proposed amendments and that none of the conditions requiring a subsequent or supplemental EIR per CEQA guidelines had occurred. An addendum appeared to be a good tool to fully explain the process and investigations that have taken place since the Delta Plan and its regulations were adopted in 2013. In May 2016, the council staff and our consultants developed a public draft addendum to provide transparency of the process and solicit input to have a robust document. A 30-day public comment period began May 12, 2016 and closed on June 13, 2016. The council received 11 comments ranging from support of the council's actions on the proposed project to amend the Delta Plan, to concerns that the council's actions may not fully address potential impacts to the Delta ecosystem, to comments that were not germane. Our consultant, Ms. Gwendolyn Buchholz, will provide a summary of the comments and responses that were included in Section 6 of the September addendum. Council members, if you choose, you would like to review them, they are included in your binders under Attachment 6, Resolution 2016-01, Exhibit A. Gwen?
As Anthony said, on the draft addendum, we received 11 letters. 3 were of support. 2 of them provided from DWR and the State Water Resources Control Board provided text changes than the way we had summarized their documents, and so that it made it a more robust, appropriate description. We received 1 comment on different types of conveyance methods that could be used for conveying water through the Delta, and 5 letters that did not support the proposal, and they went through different reasons that they were concerned. Those areas were concerned because of the lack of analysis of specific water transfers, since it was a programmatic document consistent with the programmatic Delta Plan EIR. Was concerned about the issues about the status of the current litigation on the Delta Plan and the Delta Plan EIR. There was concern that the existing condition descriptions did not capture very recent information in those of conditions that were changing since the Delta Plan EIR was published in 2013. And there was also concerns of that about the based upon other use of other recent reports on water transfers prepared by Bureau of Reclamation and also local agencies, that groundwater substitution is could be a proposed source of the transferred water, and there was a concern that we didn't address those potential impacts. And there was a concern about the use of the transferred water, especially in the San Joaquin Valley and in Southern California, leading to other effects. We did address those items within the draft plan EIR, and we pointed the areas out and cross-referenced that as part of our response to comments. We completed a response to comments as part of the final addendum to those 11 letters.
Thank you, Gwen. Ultimately, council staff and our consultants prepared a September addendum to the Delta Plan EIR regarding single-year water transfers, which is before the council for adoption. Additionally, during the development of the addendum, it was apparent that the proposed amendments will not create any change in existing physical conditions because the proposed project continued the status quo in regards to the existing Delta Plan regulation and exemption of single-year water transfers as covered actions. Thus, the proposed resolution also includes the determination that the project is exempt from CEQA. Now I'll go into the effort to amend existing regulation and amend the Delta Plan. At the direction of the Council to amend the existing Delta Plan regulation, Council staff prepared to fulfill the Administrative Procedure Act requirements by engaging with the Office of Administrative Law. Per formal rulemaking under APA, Council staff filed a notice of proposed adoption proposed in the California Regulatory Notice Register on July 22, 2016. During a 45-day public review period that began on July 22, 2016, and ended on September 6, 2016, the Council received 2 comments to consider. One was determined not to be relevant to the proposed amendment, and the second was in support of the proposed amendments. After the July 22, 2016 publication, the Council added documents and material to the rulemaking file for the public inspection and comment pursuant to Government Code 11347.1. Thus far, the Council received 13 additional comments to consider from the public during a 15-day public review period that began on September 14, 2016, and ends today at 5 p.m. 10 out of the 13 comments received were in support of the proposed amendments. There were 2 new comments that we would like to address for the record at this time. I'd like to turn it over to Bethany.
I can deal with the first comment, and I believe, Gwen, you'll handle the second. Is that correct? Or is it Ellen? Ellen will handle the second. All right. The first comment we received from Aqua Alliance pointed out that the comment period closes at 5 o'clock and wanted to ensure that the Council had the benefit of full receipt of those comments before deliberating and voting, and wanted to rest you and the public assured that that is our full intent. It's looking like this hearing will be running past 5, but we will be sending Anthony to a huddle spot to check the email at 5 o'clock and also confirm that our upstairs has received no additional mailings or drop-offs this evening, and then let you know what the status of those comments are. If we have received new comments, we'll huddle and report back to you on them. If we haven't, we'll let you know and the record reflect that no new comments have come in. And Ellen?
And the second new comment that wasn't raised in comments before and so isn't addressed yet in the responses to comment has to do with reliance on a CEQA exemption. And the response to that comment is that, as the staff report makes clear, there are no physical changes in the environment as a result of the proposed extension of the exemption. And CEQA only looks at changes in the environment, in the physical environment that have physical changes. And this exemption will continue the physical status quo and will not have any effect on the existing regulatory measures that all the other regulatory agencies currently take as well.
Thank you, Ellen. So to continue, the proposed rulemaking documents are included in your binders for your consideration as part of the resolution. The draft final statement of reasons is attachment 4. An initial statement of reasons was provided for the public during the rulemaking public comment period beginning on July 22nd. Council staff and our consultants have summarized comments that were directed at the proposed regulation during the public review periods and will be included in the final statement of reasons. Attachment 5 is the draft Standard Form 399 Economic and Fiscal Impact Statement. The draft Standard Form 399 Economic and Fiscal Impact Statement is based on the information in the Economic Impact Analysis and Assessment, which was attached to the initial statement of reasons submitted to OAL and was made available for the public review on July 22nd. No changes are recommended based on current public comment. The draft Standard Form 399 will be included in its final form in the final rulemaking record submitted to OAL. Attachment 6, Exhibit B, is the final proposed regulation language. Staff does not recommend any changes based on comments received during the public comment period. The proposed amendment to the Delta Plan Water Supply Reliability Recommendation 15 is also included in Attachment 6, Exhibit B, for your consideration as part of the resolution. So at that time, I'd like to wait until we hear from the public, and then I'll present the resolution to you.
So does that complete your report?
That completes my report, other than the resolution, or the recommendation.
Very good. So we will now begin receiving testimony, starting with John Rubin.
Good afternoon, Chairman, council members, staff. My name is John Rubin. I'm General Counsel for the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. We have previously provided comments to you both in writing and orally, and I just wanted to make a brief statement today. The amendments before the council are consistent with state policy and respect the importance of water transfers for the state of California and particularly for the members of the Water Authority. And for that reason, the Water Authority supports and encourages the council to adopt the amendments that have been proposed by your staff. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Eric Chapman.
Good afternoon. I'm the Deputy General Manager of State Water Contractors. State Water Contractors is a nonprofit mutual benefits corporation that represents 27 of the 29 State Water Project contractors. Our members utilize the State Water Project and other supplies to deliver water to more than 26 million people in California and over 750,000 acres of agricultural lands. During critical times of need, a subset of our member agencies have participated in single-year water transfers with supplies north of the Delta, and those are the programs that I have managed. The quantities transferred have historically been quite small, but they have been of great benefit during times of drought. State Water Contractors submitted letters on June 10th and September 27th in support of the addendum for single-year water transfers exemption from the Delta Plans regulation. Basically, the reasonings go that we feel that the current level of review for transfers and the formal review going through DWR and the State Water Resources Control Board is sufficient. The export of all transfers are subject to the flow and quality criteria established by State Water Resources Control Board and the biological opinions. Our transfers are subject to at least a 20% carriage water loss reduction that provides beneficial flows through the Delta during these transfers. And the last reasoning would be timing, in that we do not realize that we need these water transfers until late into the year when you realize the hydrology is not producing. We have limited time to negotiate, establish, and form these agreements and go through the current process in order to enable us to transfer it through the limited 3-month window that happens. So for these reasons, State Water Contractors support the proposed addendum to exempt the single-year transfers. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Greg Zlotnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greg Zlotnick, newly with the San Juan Water District. We are a water retail and wholesale agency that serve and treat water to about 450,000 folks, primarily in northeastern Sacramento County and southern Placer County. I will just concur with Mr. Rubin's comments, particularly about consistency with state policy. We are definitely supportive of this, and I would note that I believe letters will have been received from the Northern California Water Association as well as the El Dorado Irrigation District, and note that you have both export interests and Sacramento Valley and American River upstream interests agreeing that this is a good thing to do. And so I have a hard copy of our letter, which has been submitted electronically, but I'll also give it to your clerk. And with that, we urge your support.
Thanks, Greg. Rebecca Franklin.
Good afternoon, Chair Fiorini, council members, and staff. My name is Rebecca Franklin with the Association of California Water Agencies. As you probably already know, ACWA represents over 430 public water agencies that collectively deliver approximately 90% of the water that's delivered for agricultural, industrial, and municipal uses statewide. You've actually already heard from a couple of our members. Our members use single-year water transfers as an important mechanism for meeting water demands, especially in times of water scarcity. We believe the flexibility offered by single-year water transfers helps ensure both the co-equal goals of water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration. We appreciate the thoughtful approach that the council has used in considering the proposed amendment to exempt single-year water transfers as covered actions under the Delta Plan and supports your adoption of this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. OSHA Meserve, who I believe was unable to stay, she asked me to highlight the letter that they had submitted and regretted her inability to be here to speak in opposition to the staff resolution. John Mills. John Mills is not here. John submitted a letter in writing yesterday that has been provided to the council and will be included in the documentation. John writes in support of the resolution. Ted Trimble. Ted Trimble is not here. He likewise submitted a letter yesterday that I told him I would report in support of the resolution. Ted represents Western Canal Water District in the Sacramento Valley. John Kingsbury. John Kingsbury is not here. John also prepared and presented a letter in support of the resolution. John represents Mountain County's Water Resources Association. Is there anyone else who wishes to provide public comment? Seeing none, council members, this is your opportunity to deliberate on the matter, and Anthony will proceed to check emails, mail, drop-offs to ensure by 5 o'clock that we have considered everything that has been submitted on time. Councilmember Mary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. I have no suggested changes for the resolution itself, but maybe a question for Bethany. In the attachment 1 proposed amendment to the existing regulation, in the second or the bottom of that, where we are additionally, the description of the proposed project includes the following amendments to the Delta Plan Water Supply Reliability Recommendation 15 WRR15. Again, this is attachment 1 in the agenda packet.
Okay.
And a process question, is it okay for me to submit a request at this time, Bethany, on a language inclusion to add some additional language to that based on the formal process of today's hearing and what you're proposing that we adopt in the resolution? Because I'm not asking for a resolution change, but this is part of the proposed amendment to the existing regulation, and I know you're thinking about that in its recommendation to the California Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board, in coordination with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, that they should memorialize in writing by December 31, 2016, procedures that build upon and make routine the drought-related enhanced level of interagency cooperation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe I'll pause, Mr. Chairman, and get a response from council, and if it's appropriate, maybe there are other questions from council members.
Steve has finger on button. Do you have a response, Steve?
I'll start and just point out that the WRR1 technically is not part of the regulation. It's a recommendation from the Delta Plan. So I think there's a recommendation. I mean, this is a proposal to amend a part of the Delta Plan itself, but not being a policy, it was not formally incorporated into regulation. So making changes to this will not affect the rulemaking process that that's underway.
Thank you.
It wouldn't affect the rulemaking, but we have done CEQA on this language, so it would depend on what the language is to see whether we would also need to.
Okay, and I'll get to that point, and then we'll see where we go from there. So, Mr. Chairman, my suggestion is, if you have the document before us, again, it's attachment 1, titled Proposed Amendment to the Existing Regulation, and the last statement or sentence in that, when again we are requesting enhanced interagency cooperation review for the departments that I identified earlier. And the sentence reads, the procedure should promote increased efficiency and flexibility while ensuring the following: 1, the protection of water rights, and this is what my suggestion would be, Mr. Chairman, to include water quality in the Delta, And then it goes on in the language before us, and environmental resources, and 2, transparency and accountability, including sharing of relevant information and standardizing public reporting on cross-delta water transfers. So my suggested language inclusion for consideration of the council would be to add water quality in the delta after the protection of water rights and prior to and environmental resources. And I don't know if that would have any CEQA impacts. It shouldn't, because it would be to preserve the status quo or improve.
Yeah, I don't see any change.
I agree. I think the resolution should be amended, though, to acknowledge that the additional language doesn't change the exemption determination either, or the CEQA determination.
Right, so what we could do if the council were so inclined to accept this amendment, and you're free to discuss, but if the conclusion is you want to accept this change, we can huddle and amend the resolution while you're hearing back from Anthony about whether there were comments, come back with recommended amended resolution that you would then just deliberate and decide to move.
And if I could seek a clarifying answer, Mr. Chairman, I didn't see this language in the resolution, so I will apologize from a process perspective. I didn't
we need a chance to reread it and make sure that there doesn't need to be carryover language into the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, that would be my request for the council to consider to include water quality, again, not in the proposed amendment to the existing regulation where we are directing state departments to work collaboratively, and that they should promote increased efficiency, flexibility, including the protection of water rights and environmental resources, that we should include water quality in the Delta.
So, council members, inserting the words water quality is the question.
Can I ask a couple of questions about this? And I kind of understand water rights and environmental resources, but water quality has maybe a broader connotation. What are you hoping, or how are you interpreting the protection of water quality in this regards?
Councilmember, I'm not interpreting it. It's currently limited to promoting increased efficiency and flexibility. Mm-hmm. And if we're increasing efficiency and flexibility, we can't lose our focus also on water quality and its relationship to the co-equal goals. So we can't have efficiency and flexibility without also preserving the water quality in order to meet the 2 co-equal goals.
I'm just thinking that in terms of these transfers, it tends to add flow into the Delta from a higher water quality source. So
possibly. Well, I guess we don't know that for sure.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that we don't inadvertently create a complication where we're trying to facilitate these transfers and add something that, and maybe the question is for staff on why it was worded, and did environmental resources encompass water quality, or?
I would ask that same question.
I think we're interpreting water resources as incorporating water quality as well.
Except it says environmental resources.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. Environmental.
Okay. So your intent, Anthony, then is that the reference to environmental resource includes water quality in the Delta?
Yes.
Is that my understanding? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess, Ken, your submission is that adding more high-quality water into the flows through the Delta is likely not to degrade water quality, but to improve it?
Yeah, I mean, that's just, kind of first blush reaction that at least the constituents I think about when I think about water quality. So,
anyone else wish to weigh in? What I'm hearing is a leaning towards not accepting the addition to the language.
At this time, I'd like to point out that we have not received any more comments as of 5:01.
Okay.
Neither written, delivered, or via email electronically.
Okay. All right.
Mr. Chairman, if I can clarify, I think I understand the direction that you said council's not supportive of my additional language request, but from staff, I understand that water quality in the Delta has been protected. The intent is under the environmental resources category language.
Yes.
Thank you.
And that's a matter of record.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else the council wishes to deliberate on?
No mail.
Okay, no late comments have been received. So at this time,
Mr. Chair, if I can interrupt. I've just received, it is 5:03 p.m., and I've just received word that there has been no mail dropped off upstairs, hand or otherwise delivered. And can you confirm there's been no new emails that have received since we started this item?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, no emails have come through, and I received an email that confirms that.
okay, I think we're ready to take action.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I will move that we accept staff's recommendations for requested action. Should I read them, Bethany, or I believe items 1 through 6?
I think let's
Would you
ask
prefer
staff
staff to
for
read
the
it?
recommendation, and then let's respond.
Right. Yes, if you could close the hearing, sir, and then have, or you could have staff make the recommendation and close the hearing and take the vote.
Okay. The staff recommendation is?
I'm sorry, is the hearing closed?
No, go ahead and make your staff recommendation.
At this time, council staff recommends that council adopt Resolution 2016-01. The resolution is in your binder under Attachment 6 and includes the following. Adopt the final September addendum for the single-year water transfers. Determine that the project is exempt from CEQA pursuant to CEQA guidelines, sections 15061B3. Approve the amendment to WRR 15 in order to encourage DWR, the Water Board, and CDFW to memorialize certain interagency procedures adopted on a temporary basis in response to recent drought conditions. 4. Approve the amendments to Title 23 of the California Code of Regulations, Section 5001, Subdivision DD3, to permanently exempt single-year water transfers from the Delta Plan's regulation of covered actions. 5. Direct the executive officer to correct any errata or non-substantial changes identified at this meeting and to finalize all elements of the rulemaking package and submit it to OAL once that is complete. And 6, lastly, grant the executive officer discretion to make changes required by OAL in order to comply with the requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act and inform the council of any such changes. Thank you.
Okay, the public hearing is now closed. You have heard the staff recommendation. What is your pleasure?
I'll move staff's recommendation, Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor, Council Member Mary Pifo offers the motion. And Council Member Frank Damrell Jr. Provides the second. Discussion on the motion. Ready for the question? She'll begin with a vote. Frank?
Damrell, aye. Weinberg, aye.
Brown, aye.
Tatayan, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
PFO, aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Bethany, is there anything else we need to cover?
Congratulations.
Congratulations, and thank you all for your patience today. This meeting is now adjourned. We'll be back in action tomorrow at 9 o'clock.